My name is Michael Keane. As of 08 Fudger hours on October 12th, I have officially assumed the duties of Park Ranger, GS Hauser 25-9, at Archwood National Park. This transfer follows a 6-year tenure at Yosemite, a posting I valued immensely. However, due to personal matters requiring proximity to family on the East Coast, I requested a reassignment. The Office of Personnel Management, in its wisdom, assigned me to Archwood, a place I had, until recently, only known as a name on a list of federal park resources. My responsibilities, as per the position classification standard, remain consistent with my previous role to supervise and perform work in the conservation and use of park resources. This includes, but is not limited to, natural and cultural resource management, the operation of interpretive programs for the benefit of the visiting public, visitor protection services, and enforcement of laws and regulations pertinent to the Park Service. I am a man who believes in procedure, in the clear, delineated lines of authority and responsibility that allow us to safeguard these national treasures. There is a form for every incident, a protocol for every emergency. This structure is not just bureaucracy. It is the bedrock of order in the face of nature's inherent chaos. Archwood, I was told, is one of the more remote postings in the eastern United States, nestled deep in the oldest parts of the Appalachian Mountains. It is a world away from the granite majesty of Yosemite. The final 20 miles of the drive were on an unpaved service road that seemed to shed the modern world with every turn. The ranger station itself is a relic, a sturdy, 2-story log structure built by the Civilian Conservation Corps in the 1930s, updated over the decades but still retaining an air of profound isolation. My predecessor, a man named Thompson, according to the transfer documents, had left the place in immaculate order. The generator was full. The radio equipment passed its diagnostics, and the supply pantry was stocked for the winter. The first day was spent in methodical routine. I conducted a full inventory, cross-referencing the physical assets with the station's logbook. I walked the perimeter, checking the shutters and the integrity of the bear-proof waste containers. The air here is different. It's heavy, thick with the smell of rich, damp earth, and what can only be described as centuries of decay. The trees, towering oaks, maples, and hemlocks, form what the trail guides call a green tunnel, and even in the bright afternoon sun, the forest floor was a tapestry of deep shadows. These mountains feel ancient in a way the Sierra Nevada never did. They feel less like rock and more like sleeping giants, their stony bones covered in a thin blanket of soil and trees. There is a silence here that is not merely an absence of noise, but a presence in itself, a profound, listening quiet that seems to absorb sound before it can travel far. It was in the late afternoon, as I was organizing the kitchen, that I found it. Taped to the inside of the upper cabinet, right next to the mugs, was a single sheet of yellowed legal paper, folded twice. The paper was soft, almost cloth-like from handling, and covered in a frantic, spidery handwriting. At the top, in thick, underlined letters, were the words, "Things you ought to know. For your own good." I chuckled. assuming it was a list of local quirks, or perhaps a good-natured hazing from Ranger Thompson. I poured myself a cup of coffee and sat down at the small kitchen table to read it. The generator needs to be checked at 2200. Not a minute before, not a minute after. Top it off if needed. 2. If you hear whistling at night, go inside and lock the door. That song isn't for you. 3. The trail camera on Ridge 4 sometimes picks up static. If you see a file with a corrupted timestamp, delete it without viewing. Never try to recover it. 4. If you find animal remains with no visible wounds, leave them at the base of the large, weeping willow by the creek. Do not report it. Do not try to figure out what killed it. 5. Some nights you might see lights over Brown Mountain. Don't watch them for more than a minute. They notice when you're looking. 6. If you get a call on the radio and it's just silence, say, "The line is clear," and hang up. Don't wait for a reply. 7. NVR use the emergency flare gun, unless the fire is something you can see. 8. There is a set of stone stairs deep in the North Woods that doesn't lead anywhere. You've seen them on the map. Do not go near them. If a hiker reports them, tell them they are mistaken. Log it as a false report. 9. If you see a man with a face that looks or blurry, do not make eye contact. He is not lost. He knows exactly where he is. Turn around and walk away. Don't leave food out for the bears, especially not the one that walks on 2 legs. I read the list twice. My initial amusement curdled into a kind of professional annoyance. This was precisely the sort of thing that gave rangers in remote posts a bad name. Succumbing to isolation, spinning folk tales, and blurring the lines between superstition and safety protocol. The reference to the Brown Mountain lights was a known piece of local folklore, easily explained by atmospheric phenomena or distant vehicle lights. The stairs in the woods was a recurring theme in online horror stories, a modern urban legend for the digital age. And the rest, vague, unhelpful, and frankly, unprofessional. What if a hiker was genuinely in distress and I hung up because of some silent call? Rule. What if the blurry-faced man was a stroke victim in desperate need of medical attention? My job is to provide assistance, to investigate, to be a beacon of calm authority in the wilderness. These rules were a direct contradiction of my duties. They encouraged dereliction, misdirection, and the abandonment of the very people I was sworn to protect. I considered throwing the list away, but something stayed my hand. It was a curiosity, a relic of my predecessor's apparent decline into paranoia. I folded it carefully and tucked it into the back of the station's official logbook. Later that evening, I made my first formal entry. October 12, 2030. All systems operational. Station inventory complete. No unusual incidents to report. Note: predecessor left a list of unofficial protocols. Appears to be a mix of local folklore and potential stress-related ideation. Will adhere strictly to established NPS guidelines and procedures. The safety of the public and the integrity of park resources are paramount and cannot be compromised by unsubstantiated local legends. Keen M. Park Ranger. As I wrote, I felt a sense of satisfaction. I was re-establishing order. I was a professional. a man of science and regulation. A place had clearly gotten the better of my predecessor. I would not make the same mistakes. I would not make the silence and the shadows play tricks on my mind. Here, in Archwood, the rules were clear. They were written in federal code, printed in manuals, and backed by the full authority of the United States government. Those were the only rules that mattered. That night, the wind picked up, and the ancient trees around the station began to creak and groan like the timbers of a sinking ship. I dismissed the sounds, finished my coffee, and prepared for my first full day in the woods. I was confident. I was prepared. I was, in hindsight, a fool. The first official day of patrol began as expected. The morning air was sharp and cold, carrying the scent of damp soil and pine. My agenda was straightforward: a full circuit of the park's primary northern loop, checking trail conditions, looking for signs of illegal trapping, and generally establishing a presence. I am, by nature and by training, a creature of habit and procedure. My predecessor's list of nonsensical rules was a footnote in my logbook, an amusing anecdote to perhaps share at a future regional meeting, but nothing more. My focus was on the tangible, the observable, the tasks outlined in the Park Ranger GS 025 position description. It was mid-morning when I made the first discovery. On the bank of a fast, running creek, half in a thicket of rhododendron, lay the carcass of a large white-tailed deer. Standard procedure dictates a thorough examination and report. I unslung my pack and pulled on a pair of latex gloves. As I approached, a line from the yellowed paper surfaced, in my mind unbidden. Rule Feint 4. If you find animal remains with no visible wounds, leave them at the base of the large, weeping willow by the creek. Do not report it. I scanned the area. Sure enough, about 50 yards downstream, a massive weeping willow drooped over the water. A coincidence. I knelt by the deer. It was a healthy-looking buck, its coat sleek, its eyes glassy but clear. I spent 20 minutes performing a meticulous inspection. There were no puncture wounds, no signs of a predator attack, no bullet holes, no evidence of arrow or bolt. Its legs weren't broken from a fall. It was simply dead. I've seen animals die from disease, from freak accidents, from starvation. There is always a sign, a physical clue. Here, there was nothing. It was as if the life had just been neatly extracted from it. The professional in me documented the finding, took photographs, and logged the coordinates. The man standing alone in the deep woods felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. I did not move the carcass to the willow tree. I reported it as per federal guidelines. I continued my patrol, the silence of the forest pressing in. It's a different kind of quiet here than in Yosemite. The Sierra Nevada has a clean, vast silence. This is a heavy, listening silence, as if the trees and the moss and the ancient rock are holding their breath, waiting. My route took me toward the northern boundary, into a section of old-growth forest marked on the map as largely undeveloped. And there, on the map, was the anomaly that corresponded with another of Thompson's rules, a small icon denoting a man-made structure with no label. Rule 88. There is a set of stone stairs deep in the North Woods that doesn't lead anywhere. Do not go near them. My duty is to inventory and assess all park features, marked or unmarked. To ignore it would be negligent. I left the main trail and pushed through dense undergrowth, following my compass bearing. After a half hour of hiking, I found them. They were exactly as the urban legends describe: a flight of stone stairs, perhaps 40 steps in total, rising from the forest floor and ending abruptly in mid-air. They were covered in moss and ancient grime, the stones expertly cut, but clearly centuries old. They led to nothing. There was no collapsed ruin, no foundation, no clearing, just more forest. It was a profound and unsettling violation of logic. Stairs are a tool of transition, meant to connect a lower place to a higher one. These connected nothing to nowhere. I walked around them, touching the cold, damp stone. No birds sang. I felt a powerful, irrational sense of being watched, of trespassing in a place I was not meant to be. I took a photo for the official record, my hand shaking slightly as I put the camera away. I wrote it off as a historical curiosity, a forgotten folly from some long, dead settler. But the explanation felt thin, a flimsy shield against a creeping dread. Back at the station that evening, the sun bled out of the sky, leaving the mountains in shades of bruised purple and black. I was finalizing my patrol report when the radio crackled to life. It wasn't the clean burst of a call from dispatch, but a hiss of empty air. Then silence. A dead channel. I waited. Rule Phase 6. If you get a call on the radio and it's just silence, say, "The line is clear," and hang up. This was absurd. It could be a lost hiker with a failing battery, their last desperate attempt to make contact. This is Ranger Keene at Archwood Station. I have an open line with static. Please repeat your transmission, over. I spoke with the calm, measured authority my training dictated. The only reply was the continued, profound silence. It felt different from an empty channel. It felt weighted, like a held breath. If you can hear me and are unable to transmit, try keying your microphone twice. Nothing. After 5 minutes of attempting to establish contact according to protocol, the line clicked off. I sat back. The silence of the room, now feeling as charged as the one on the radio. A deep sense of unease washed over me. Had I done the right thing? Later, as I was cleaning my dinner plate, I heard it. A faint, melodic sound drifting on the night air. Whistling. I froze, every muscle tensed. Rule Fate 2. If you hear whistling at night, go inside and lock the door. That song isn't for you. I was already inside, but the sound made the sturdy log walls of the station feel paper thin. It wasn't a tune I recognized. It was intricate, with strange, lilting trills and deep, mournful notes that seemed to hang in the air. It sounded inhuman. The whistling moved around the station, a slow, deliberate circuit. My heart hammered against my ribs. I was a federal officer. I was armed. But my hand went to the deadbolt on the main door and twisted it. The solid thunk of the bolt sliding home was a small comfort. I crept to the window, peering out into the impenetrable darkness beyond the station's porch light. I saw nothing but the swaying silhouettes of the trees. Then, as suddenly as it began, the whistling stopped. The ensuing silence was somehow worse, filled with a terrifying sense of anticipation. I tried to rationalize it. The wind. A strange bird. My own mind, stressed and isolated, playing tricks on me. I needed to reassert control. To ground myself in the logical, I looked at the clock. 21:55. My eyes fell on the list, which I'd left on the table. Rule Fe 1. The generator needs to be checked at 2200. Not a minute before, not a minute after. A wave of defiant anger washed over me. This was the final absurdity. A diesel generator does not operate on magical timetables. I would check it now. I would prove to myself that these rules were the product of a lonely man's fractured psyche. I grabbed my high, lumen flashlight, took a deep breath, and unlocked the door. The night air was frigid, and the darkness was absolute. A physical presence that seemed to swallow the light from the porch. The generator shed was 100 feet from the station. I walked down the steps, my boots crunching on the gravel path. I swept the beam of my flashlight across the tree line, the light cutting a sharp, white blade through the black. And then it stopped. The beam landed on a figure standing just at the edge of the woods. It was tall, impossibly so, and stood on two long legs. It was not a bear. It was not a man. My mind struggled to process what I was seeing, to fit it into a known category. And then I saw its face, or rather, where its face should have been. It was a shifting, indistinct blur like a photograph horribly out of focus. Rule 89. If you see a man with a face that looks wrong or blurry, do not make eye contact. He is not lost. He knows exactly where he is. Turn around and walk away. My blood ran cold. My feet were rooted to the spot, every instinct screaming at me to run. Yet my professional duty to investigate held me captive. The blurry-faced man did not move. He just stood there, in the silent, listening darkness of Archwood Park, and he was looking right at me. Time, as a measurable concept, ceased to exist. My world compressed to the space between my own frantic heartbeats and the static figure at the edge of the woods. It was a violation of all known categories, a walking, breathing impossibility. My training, my years of service, every protocol I had ever memorized, provided no framework for a man with a face that wasn't a face. It was a vortex, a smudge in the fabric of reality, and it was looking at me. Rule 89. If you see a man with a face that looks wrong or blurry, do not make eye contact. The warning screamed in my mind, but it was too late. I had looked, I had been seen. A cold, analytical part of my brain. The part that writes incident reports and testifies in court, tried to assert itself. Subject is approximately 2 meters tall, bipedal, exhibiting no discernible facial features. Possible visual hallucination induced by stress and isolation. But I knew it wasn't a hallucination. The sheer presence of the thing was a weight on the air, a pressure against my senses. It didn't move, it didn't make a sound. But I felt a sense of profound, ancient scrutiny, as if I were a microbe being examined under a microscope. Turn around and walk away. The second part of the rule. My legs were leaden, my muscles locked in a primal freeze response. To turn my back on it felt like the most profound folly imaginable. But the alternative, to stand there until it decided to act, was unthinkable. With a surge of will that felt like tearing my own skin, I broke my gaze, focusing on the gravel path in front of me. I turned, my movements stiff and robotic, and began to walk back toward the station. I did not run. Running felt like an admission of prey status. Every step was a deliberate, measured act of defiance against the terror that was screaming at me to flee. The 100-foot walk back to the cabin became the longest journey of my life. The night, which had been filled with the familiar sounds of wind and rustling leaves, was now utterly silent. Or perhaps the roaring in my ears simply drowned everything else out. I felt its gaze on my back, a physical weight that threatened to crush me. I didn't dare look back. I reached the porch, fumbled with the doorknob, and stumbled inside, slamming the heavy oak door and throwing the deadbolt with a crash that echoed in the sudden stillness. I leaned against the door, my breath coming in ragged, painful gasps. My professional composure was not just cracked, it was shattered. I slid down the door to the floor, my sidearm feeling like a useless toy against whatever was out there. After several minutes, I managed to get to my feet and stumble to the kitchen table. I pulled the yellowed list from the logbook. It was no longer a relic of my predecessor's paranoia. It was a testament, a survival guide. I read it again, and this time, the words were not suggestions, but commandments etched in fire. Rule why for high, animal remains with no visible wounds. The deer. I had logged it, reported it. A violation. Rule height 80, the stone stairs. I had approached them, photographed them. A violation. Rule face 6C, the silent radio call. I had tried to respond, to follow protocol. A violation. Rule faith 2, the whistling. I had locked the door, but I had listened. Rule whence the generator. I had deliberately gone out at 21:55, 5 minutes early, in a fit of professional pique. And it had been waiting for me. My arrogance, my rigid adherence to a set of rules, designed for a world that apparently did not exist here, had led me directly into the path of these things. Thompson hadn't been crazy. He had been trying to survive. A flicker of movement outside the window caught my eye. I crept towards it, my heart in my throat. High above the dark silhouette of Brown Mountain, a series of glowing orbs danced in the sky. They pulsed with a soft, internal light, moving in silent, impossible patterns, drifting, hovering, then darting at incredible speeds. Rule Fay 5. Some nights, you might see lights over Brown Mountain. Don't watch them for more than a minute. They notice when you're looking. I felt a strange pull, a hypnotic fascination. But the memory of the blurry face was still seared into my mind. I counted to 60. My lips moving silently, then tore my eyes away from the window. My skin crawling with the renewed sensation of being watched. I spent the next few hours in a state of vigilant terror, jumping at every creak of the old cabin. Sleep was an impossibility. Just after 0200, a new sound began. A loud, rhythmic banging from the direction of the waste disposal area. It wasn't the sound of a foraging animal. It was heavy, metallic, and deliberate. Clang. BNG. I crawled to the small window on the far side of the station that overlooked the bare, proof dumpsters. peering through the glass. I saw it, a hulking shape silhouetted against the faint starlight. It was massive, far larger than any black bear in these mountains, and it was standing on two legs. It moved with a lurching, unnatural gait, tearing at the reinforced steel lid of a dumpster with thick, clawed hands. Rule Fay 10. Don't leave food out for the bears. Especially not the one that walks on two legs. I shrank back from the window, my breath catching in my chest. It was methodically trying to get into the trash, a grotesque parody of a common raccoon, and the sheer, brutal strength it was exerting was terrifying. The rest of the night passed in a blur of fear, when the first gray light of dawn finally filtered through the trees. It felt less like a sunrise and more like a temporary ceasefire. I was exhausted, but my mind was racing. I had to maintain some semblance of my duties, if only to keep myself from completely breaking down. I powered on my station computer to download the data from the park's trail cameras, a routine task that now felt fraught with peril. I clicked through the files: a fox trotting down a path, a doe and her fawn, a raccoon, normalcy. Then I got to the folder for Ridge 4. My blood ran cold. There it was. A single video file, time-stamped with a string of corrupted characters, 26188. Rule 23. If you see a file with a corrupted timestamp, delete it without viewing. Envier, try to recover it. My training, the very core of my professional identity, screamed at me to do the opposite. This was data, an anomaly. It needed to be analyzed, understood, reported. What if it was evidence of a poacher using a signal jammer? What if it was a clue to a missing hiker? But the list, Thompson's list, was just as loud in my head. Envier, try to recover it. I stared at the file name, my hand trembling on the mouse. My entire worldview had been upended in less than 24 hours. The man of science and regulation was at war with the terrified survivor. What unknown horror was contained in that file? So terrible that the only safe course of action was to pretend it never existed. With a choked sob, I clicked on the file and dragged it to the trash icon. I emptied the trash, then ran a secure delete function, erasing every trace of it from the system. The act was a surrender. I was no longer Ranger Keen, GS Yauder 25-9. I was just a man in a wooden box, surrounded by things that defied explanation. And the only rules that mattered now were the ones written on a sheet of yellowed paper. I sat back, shaking, the silence of the station pressing in on me. I had to document this. I opened the official log. My hands hovered over the keyboard, but the formal language of reports felt like a foreign tongue. What could I possibly write? Observed bipedal ursine entity. Witnessed anomalous aerial phenomena. Erased corrupted data file based on unofficial, superstitious protocol. They would pull me for a psych evaluation. I typed, deleted, and typed again, finally settling on a single, frantic line. October 13, 6:30. The rules are real, all of them. As I stared at the words on the screen, a new sound started. It was soft, rhythmic. Thump. Thump. It came from the wall behind me. It wasn't a knock. It wasn't an animal scratching. It was the sound of something heavy and soft, patiently, deliberately, bumping against the outside of the cabin, as if testing the strength of the logs. and it didn't stop. The thumping against the log wall was soft, yet it resonated through the cabin like a heartbeat. Thump, thump, thump. It was patient, methodical. Not the frantic scrabbling of an animal, but the deliberate testing of a structure by something that had all the time in the world. I remained frozen, a statue carved from fear, my back pressed against the opposite wall. My mind, once a fortress of regulations and scientific reason, was now a wasteland. The only thoughts that remained were the frantic, spidery words on the yellowed paper. The list was no longer a guide, it was the only reality. The thumping moved along the exterior of the station, a slow, investigative circuit. It paused at the window, and I held my breath, expecting the glass to shatter. But it didn't. The sound simply moved on, continuing its patient, rhythmic probing. I was prey in a box, and the predator was inspecting the trap. The night stretched into an eternity of listening, every creak of the old building a potential prelude to annihilation. Sleep was a forgotten luxury. I sat at the kitchen table, the useless weight of my service pistol on my hip, my gaze fixed on the list as if it were a holy text that could somehow ward off the encroaching darkness. When dawn finally broke, it brought no relief, only a gray, washed-out light that made the world look sick and tired. The thumping had stopped hours ago, but the silence it left behind was heavy with menace. I was a prisoner. To flee into the woods was to run into the arms of the things that hunted there. To stay was to wait for the walls to finally give way. My professional training was a mockery. What good was a course on visitor, protection against a thing with a blurry face? What was the protocol for a bear that walked on two legs and had the strength to peel steel? It was then that I heard it, a new sound piercing the morning quiet. It was the sound of a child crying. My blood ran cold. It wasn't a faint, looping cry like the one from the Saar story I'd once heard. This sounded real, desperate, and achingly human. It came from the direction of the creek, somewhere deep in the woods. Every instinct, every fiber of my being as a park ranger, screamed at me to respond. This was my core function: to render aid, to protect the vulnerable. I remembered the case file from my predecessor's time, the little boy taken by the bear man, who had a weird face. Was this another child, another victim? I grabbed the radio, my hands shaking. Archwood Station to dispatch. Do you copy? Static. Only static. I tried again, my voice cracking. This is Ranger Keene. I have a possible child in distress, requesting immediate assistance. Over. The silence that answered was absolute, a void that swallowed my words. I was alone. Utterly and completely alone. The crying grew louder, more insistent. It was a sound of pure terror and pain, a sound designed to trigger an immediate, protective response in any decent human being. I looked at the list. There was no rule for a crying child. It was an unforeseen variable, a test that fell outside the established parameters of this nightmare. My mind raced, trying to find a loophole, a justification. My duty was clear, but the woods were not. My eyes fell on the emergency kit mounted on the wall. Inside, nestled in its foam casing, was the flare gun. And the final, Untested rules slammed into my consciousness. Rule Feint 7. MVR: use the emergency flare gun, unless the fire is something you can see. The conflict was a physical agony. To abandon a child was to abandon my oath, my very identity. But to break a rule on this list, every violation so far had led to a more direct, more terrifying consequence. The crying became a wail, a raw plea for help that tore at my soul. I had to do something. I couldn't just sit here and let a child die. A desperate rationalization formed in my shattered mind. A fire you can see. An emergency is a fire. A child in mortal danger is the biggest fire of all. I could see it in my mind. A clear and present blaze that I was bound to extinguish. It was a flimsy argument, a lawyer's trick played on the devil. But it was all I had. With a guttural cry, I grabbed the kit, ripped open the latch, and seized the flare gun. I burst out of the station door, the cold morning air hitting my face. The child's cries seemed to come from everywhere at once. Now, I didn't hesitate. I raised the pistol to the sky, pulled the trigger, and fired. A brilliant red star shot into the air, leaving a trail of smoke. It reached its apex and hung there for a moment, a beautiful, defiant symbol of hope against the oppressive gray sky. And the crying stopped. For a single, blessed second, there was silence. A profound, peaceful quiet. I felt a wave of relief so powerful it almost brought me to my knees. I had done it. I had acted. I had chosen humanity over fear. Then, the new sound began. A low, resonant hum that seemed to come not from the woods, but from the sky itself. It grew in intensity, vibrating in my bones, in my teeth. I looked up. The lights I had seen over Brown Mountain were back. But they were not distant anymore. They were descending, dozens of them, glowing orbs of silent, cold light converging on my position. The flare hadn't been a call for help. It was a beacon, a dinner bell, the fire you can see. The horrifying, literal truth crashed down on me. The flare was a fire. I had lit a fire in the sky, and now they could see it. They descended into the clearing around the station, silent and terrible. In the cold, alien light, I saw them. The blurry, faced man was there, standing impassively at the edge of the trees. The bipedal bear emerged from the shadows, its claws scraping softly on the rock. And there were others. Shapes that twisted and broke the laws of geometry. Things that my mind refused to fully process. They were not of this world. They were the reason for the rules. The rules weren't a defense. They were a treaty. A list of ways to avoid notice. And I had just announced my presence to all of them. With the last dregs of my adrenaline, I scrambled back inside the station, slamming and bolting the door. The hum was deafening now. The entire cabin began to vibrate. The light pouring through the windows was blinding. I knew the walls wouldn't hold. I knew I was already dead. But there was one last thing I had to do. One final act of a park ranger. I lunged for the logbook, for the yellowed paper tucked inside. I grabbed a pen, my hand shaking uncontrollably, and scrawled a final entry. A last desperate warning to whoever came next. October 14, 0915. The rules are real. All of them. I broke Rule Phase 7. The flare is the fire. It's not a signal. It's a summons. They see it. They come for it. Don't make my mistake. My name is Arthur Wells. For the better part of 2 decades, I served as a senior archivist for a modest university library, a role I found deeply satisfying. My days were spent amidst the quiet rustle of turning pages and the unique, dry scent of aging paper, a sanctuary of order and accumulated knowledge. I have always been a man of quiet habits, preferring the meticulous organization of facts and histories to the often chaotic interactions of the wider world. The decision to seek employment as a fire lookout was, therefore, somewhat out of character. Yet it stemmed from a profound need for an even deeper solitude. The recent passing of my mother, herself a woman of reclusive tendencies, had left me with a small inheritance and an even larger silence in my life. The relentless thrum of the city, once a background hum, had become an irritant, and the prospect of a season spent in the remote wilderness, surrounded by nothing but trees and sky, held an undeniable, almost medicinal allure. I imagined it as a period of quiet contemplation, a balm for a mind wary of noise and the subtle complexities of grief. The journey to Blackwood Peak Lookout was an exercise in progressive isolation. It began on a state highway, then devolved to a winding county road, its asphalt cracked and patched. This, in turn, gave way to a gravel track that rattled the old Forest Service pickup truck Henderson, the district ranger, was driving. Henderson was a man of few words, his face a roadmap of sun and wind, and he seemed to regard my city-bred quietness with a sort of wary acceptance. Finally, the gravel surrendered to a rutted dirt path barely wide enough for the vehicle, clawing its way up the mountainside. The last mile, Henderson informed me with a grunt, was on foot. He left me at a small, sun-dappled clearing with my modest rucksack and a final, appraising look. "She's all yours," he'd said, gesturing vaguely upwards with his chin before retreating in the rattling truck, the sound of its engine slowly fading until it was swallowed entirely by the vast, indifferent silence of the forest. The tower itself, when I finally reached it after a steep, breath-stealing climb, was an impressive, if somewhat unsettling, structure. It was an older model, all steel girders and weathered wood. Perhaps an Aeromotor MC-39 or something similar from that era, perched on the very apex of Blackwood Peak like a skeletal raptor. It rose a good 60 feet from its concrete footing, a narrow, enclosed cabin at its summit, surrounded by a railed catwalk. The view was, as promised, panoramic. An endless, undulating ocean of green stretched in every direction. The distant peaks of other mountains, hazy blue against the horizon. It was beautiful, certainly, but also profoundly daunting. There was a palpable sense of being utterly alone, a tiny, insignificant speck on this mountaintop fortress, as the previous lookout had apparently called it in the logbook. Henderson had mentioned him briefly, a young man, eager at first, who had left in a bit of a hurry, his contract unfulfilled. Didn't take to the quiet, I suppose. Henderson had mused, though his tone suggested there might have been more to it. The cabin was Spartan but functional. A built-in bunk, a small wood burning stove, a desk bolted to the floor, and the all-important Osborne Firefinder. Its brass, gleaming dully in the afternoon light. After stowing my gear, a selection of books I deemed suitably contemplative, a sturdy thermos and practical, if unexciting, outdoor clothing, I began a more thorough inspection. It was then tacked neatly to the back of the cabin door with 4 tarnished thumbtacks that I found it. A single sheet of thick, slightly yellowed paper, protected by a surprisingly robust laminate. Typed neatly across the top was the heading, "The Blackwood Peak Lookout Official Regulations," and conduct. My eyebrows rose. Henderson had given me the standard Forest Service manual, a hefty tome detailing everything from radio protocols to wildfire suppression techniques. This, however, was something else entirely. I unpinned it and read 1. Never acknowledge the whistling you hear after sunset. It is not the wind. 2. The western window shutter must remain bolted from dusk until dawn. No exceptions. 3. If the radio broadcasts a children's song between 300 a.m. and 3:15 a.m., turn it off immediately. Do not listen to the end. Under no circumstances attempt to identify the source. 4. You may see a single light moving through the trees far below, especially on moonless nights. Do not report it. It is not a lost hiker. Do not attempt to signal it. 5. Should you find any carvings or symbols etched into the tower structure that were not there previously, report their appearance and exact location in the logbook. Do not touch them. 6. If you hear knocking on the trapdoor to the catwalk after midnight, ignore it. You are alone. 7. Food supplies are to be stored in the provided metal containers only. Ensure they are sealed tightly each night. This is not solely for rodent prevention. If you wake to find all your books rearranged on the shelves, leave the cabin for 1 hour, regardless of the weather. Do not attempt to put them back in order until you return. 9. The old generator may sometimes run erratically. However, if it stops completely during a clear night with no wind, do not attempt to restart it until sunrise. 10. Do not speak of what you see or hear during the deep hours of the night to anyone over the radio, unless it is a confirmed fire. Some things listen. I read the list twice, a faint smile playing on my lips. It was, I concluded, a rather elaborate piece of hazing for the new man. Or perhaps the literary efforts of a predecessor whose solitude had frayed the edges of his sanity. The almost bureaucratic presentation, the lamination, the neat typing, only added to the absurdity. Rodent prevention, indeed. I was a man of logic, an archivist. My concerns were with verifiable facts, with the documented procedures in the official manual. I pinned the list back onto the door, a curious relic of someone else's anxieties, and turned my attention to the more pressing matters of settling in. The first night descended with an almost theatrical grandeur. The sun bled crimson and gold across the western sky before sinking behind the distant ranges, and the stars emerged with a brilliance I hadn't witnessed in decades, undimmed by city haze. The silence was profound, a living entity that pressed in from all sides. I made a few entries in the official logbook, familiarized myself with the radio call signs, and read a chapter of Marcus Aurelius by the light of a kerosene lamp. The generator. A temperamental beast according to Henderson, I decided to save for when truly necessary. As the hours deepened, I found myself listening more intently than usual. The wind, a constant presence at this altitude, sighed and moaned around the cabin, occasionally rattling a loose pane of glass in its frame. Once, I thought I heard a faint, high-pitched sound, a thin thread of noise that seemed to weave through the deeper tones of the wind. Rule 1 flickered at the edge of my memory. It is not the wind. I dismissed it. An animal, perhaps, or merely the tower settling? Its steel contracting in the cooling air. Such structures were known for their peculiar acoustics. Later, as I was drifting towards sleep on the narrow bunk, the radio crackled. A burst of static, sharp and sudden. My eyes snapped open. It was just shy of 300 a.m. Rule 3, a children's song between 300 a.m. and 3:15 a.m. I held my breath, listening. More static. Then silence. Just interference, I told myself, common in these remote, mountainous regions. Still, a faint prickle of unease traced its way down my spine. An unwelcome sensation I attributed to fatigue and the unfamiliar surroundings. Just before I finally succumbed to sleep, I was looking out the eastern window, towards the pale wash of the pre-dawn sky. At the very periphery of my vision, something seemed to flicker among the dark, unmoving shapes of the trees far below. A brief, indistinct movement. When I turned my head to focus, there was nothing but the impenetrable blackness of the forest. An optical illusion, I reasoned. A trick of tired eyes in the low light. The mind, especially one accustomed to the constant stimulus of urban life, could play strange games when confronted with such profound sensory stillness. The previous lookout, I mused, had likely fallen prey to such imaginings, his isolation breeding phantoms from the mundane. I resolved then to be more disciplined, to not allow the vast emptiness to populate itself with unwarranted fears. I was Arthur Wells, a man of reason. And reason, I was certain, would prevail. The following days settled into a peculiar rhythm, a blend of the mundane tasks of a lookout and the subtle, persistent hum of the unexplained that seemed to emanate from the very fabric of Blackwood Peak. I diligently performed my duties. Regular sweeps of the horizon with the binoculars, meticulous recording of weather patterns, wind speed, direction, temperature, cloud cover, and the obligatory radio check. Ends with Henderson, whose gruff voice was a strangely comforting, if distant, link to the ordinary world. I spent a good deal of time studying the topographical maps, familiarizing myself with the names of distant ridges, valleys, and the intricate network of creeks that spiderwebbed across the vast green expanse. This was, after all, my primary function, the reason for my presence here. Yet, the official regulations and conduct list, still tacked to the door, exerted a subtle influence, a kind of cognitive itch. I found my gaze drawn to it more often than I cared to admit. Each rule, initially dismissed as a prank or the ramblings of a disturbed mind, began to take on a more insidious quality as small, inexplicable events chipped away at my determined rationalism. The whistling, for instance. Rule 1T. Never acknowledge the whistling you hear after sunset. It is not the wind. It returned the second night, and the third. It was not the mournful sigh of wind through the steel girders of the tower, nor the rustle of air through the dense pine needles. This was a distinct, almost melodic sound, yet utterly devoid of warmth or human intention. It seemed to drift from the deep woods to the north, a series of rising and falling notes that were too patterned, too deliberate, to be a natural phenomenon. The first time I heard it clearly, a shiver traced its way down my spine, despite the residual warmth from the small wood stove. I found myself consciously turning my attention elsewhere, focusing intently on a passage. In Seneca, the Stoic philosophy, a deliberate counterpoint to the unsettling sound. I did not acknowledge it, just as the rule dictated, but the effort of not acknowledging it was, in itself, a form of acknowledgement. The western window shutter, Rule 20. The western window shutter must remain closed and bolted from dusk until dawn. No exceptions. Became a focal point of a strange, self-imposed vigilance. It was a heavy wooden shutter, reinforced with iron bands, and secured from the inside by two thick bolts. Each evening as the sun began its descent, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, I would ensure those bolts were firmly in place. There was no logical reason for this particular window to be singled out. All the windows were of similar construction, offering similar views. Yet, the specificity of the rule gnawed at me. One evening, driven by a perverse curiosity I immediately regretted, I delayed bolting it by a mere 10 minutes past dusk. Nothing happened. The forest outside remained dark and silent, save for the usual nocturnal chorus of insects and the distant hoot of an owl. And yet, when I finally slid the bolts home, the sense of relief was disproportionate, almost shameful. It was as if, by obeying the arbitrary instruction, I had narrowly averted some unseen, unspecified consequence. The radio, Rule 3. If the radio broadcasts a children's song between 300 a.m. and 3:15 a.m., turn it off immediately. Do not listen to the end. Under no circumstances attempt to identify this remained silent during those proscribed early morning hours for several nights. After the initial burst of static, I found myself waking instinctively a few minutes before 3000 a.m., a knot of anxiety in my stomach, listening to the faint hiss of the receiver. The silence was almost worse than the static had been. It was a loaded silence, pregnant with a possibility I was trying to deny. I told myself it was the power of suggestion, the list planting seeds of unease. In my mind, my subconscious fabricating these anxieties from the thin air of solitude, the single light in the trees. Rule 40. You may see a single light moving through the trees far below, especially on moonless nights. Do not report it. It is not a lost hiker. Do not attempt to signal it. Did appear. It was on the fourth night, a night of inky blackness, with no moon to silver the landscape. I was on the catwalk, taking in the cool night air, the vastness of the starry sky a dizzying spectacle. Then I saw it, a small, steady yellow light, like a lantern, moving slowly and deliberately through the dense forest on the lower slope of the eastern ridge. My first instinct, the ingrained response of any responsible lookout, was to grab the binoculars, to try and ascertain its nature. A lost hiker. Poachers. But the rule, stark and unequivocal, flashed in my mind. It is not a lost hiker. I watched it for several minutes, a cold dread creeping into me. It moved with an unnatural smoothness, not bobbing or wavering, as a handheld lantern would. It simply glided, a solitary spark in the immense darkness, before disappearing behind a thick stand of firs. I did not report it. I did not signal it. I retreated into the cabin, the image of that silent, purposeful light burning in my memory. The carvings, Rule 5e. Should you find any carvings or symbols etched into the tower structure that were not there previously, report their appearance and exact location in the logbook. Do not touch them. They were perhaps the most overtly unsettling development. On the morning of the 5th day, as I was conducting my routine inspection of the tower's exterior, I found one. It was on the steel support beam of the northeast leg, about 10 feet from the ground, a crude, spiral symbol, about the size of my palm, freshly gouged into the metal. It hadn't been there the day before. I was certain of it. My archival training had instilled in me a keen eye for detail, for changes in the state of objects. This was new. The metal around the edges of the carving was bright, almost gleaming where the weathered paint and rust had been scraped away. It was not a symbol I recognized from any known iconography, though it had a vaguely unsettling, organic quality to it. My heart hammered against my ribs. I meticulously recorded its appearance and location in the official logbook, as instructed. My hand surprisingly unsteady. New carving NE support approx. Tef from base, spiral pattern. I wrote, the words looking stark and inadequate on the page. I resisted the urge to touch it, the cold metal seeming to radiate a faint, almost imperceptible wrongness. The knocking Rule 6c. If you hear knocking on the trapdoor to the catwalk after midnight, ignore it. You are alone. Began on the 6th night. I was reading. The silence of the cabin, broken only by the rhythmic tick of my watch and the occasional creak of the tower settling. It was well past midnight. Then a distinct, deliberate thump, thump, thump from directly above me, on the trapdoor that provided access to the catwalk from within the cabin. My blood ran cold. I froze, the book slipping from my fingers. You are alone. The words from the list echoed in my mind, a chilling affirmation. The knocking came again, louder this time, more insistent. Thump, THUMP, thump. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't an animal. It sounded like knuckles on wood, a human sound. Yet there was no one else for miles, a fact Henderson had repeatedly, if indirectly, emphasized. My breath hitched in my throat. I sat there, rigid, for what felt like an eternity, every nerve ending screaming. I did not move. I did not make a sound. Eventually, the knocking ceased, leaving a silence that was somehow more terrifying than the sound itself. Sleep was impossible that night. I sat at the desk, the kerosene lamp casting flickering shadows, till the first gray light of dawn began to seep through the eastern window. My carefully constructed edifice of logic was beginning to crumble. These were not isolated incidents easily dismissed. They were a pattern, a series of occurrences that directly corresponded to that bizarre list on the door. The previous lookout, the young man who had left in a bit of a hurry. His departure suddenly seemed less about an aversion to quiet and more about an encounter with something else. The solitude I had craved was transforming, the silence no longer peaceful, but filled with an expectant, predatory quality. I found myself jumping at sudden noises, my senses on high alert, the familiar comfort of my books offering less and less solace. The wilderness, once a symbol of contemplative retreat, now felt vast, ancient, and indifferent to my civilized sensibilities, perhaps even actively hostile. The thought that I was merely a temporary, unwelcome intrusion in a place with its own ancient, unknowable rules was beginning to take root in my mind, a seed of primal fear. And the season had only just begun. The 7th day at Blackwood Peak. Lookout dawned gray and oppressive. The sky a bruised blanket that mirrored the growing turmoil within me. My meticulously kept logbook, once a testament to my orderly mind, now contained entries that seemed to belong to a different man, a man teetering on the edge of an abyss I had never known existed. The neat, precise script of my early days had become slightly more erratic, the ink sometimes smudged as if by a trembling hand. Sleep was a scarce commodity, snatched in brief, anxious bursts, and the solitude I had once romanticized now felt like a suffocating shroud. Rule 7. Regarding the food containers, food supplies are to be stored in the provided metal containers only. Ensure they are sealed tightly each night. This is not solely for rodent prevention. Had taken on a new, sinister dimension. I had, of course, followed it diligently from the start. They were standard Forest Service issue. Heavy, gauge steel with tight, fitting lids and sturdy latches. Rodents, even bears, would have found them a challenge. Yet, on the morning of the 7th day, I found the container, holding my supply of dried beans and rice subtly disturbed. The latches were still fastened, but the lid was slightly askew, as if something had tried, with considerable force, to pry it open from one side, then given up. There were no claw marks, no teeth marks. Just a faint indentation along the rim where some immense pressure had been applied. More unsettling were the faint, almost greasy fingerprints, or what looked like fingerprints, though they were too long, too thin, smudged on the dusty metal. I felt a wave of nausea. This was no animal. The phrase, not solely for rodent prevention, echoed with chilling understatement. I checked the other containers. They were untouched. But the message was clear: something new, where my sustenance was, and it was capable of interacting with my environment in a disturbingly intelligent way. That afternoon, the generators, Rule 90. The old generator may sometimes run erratically. However, if it stops completely during a clear night with no wind, do not attempt to restart it until sunrise. Decided to test my resolve. The day had remained unnervingly still, the air heavy and stagnant, not a breath of wind stirring the pines. The sky, though overcast, showed no sign of an impending storm. I had switched on the generator for an hour to recharge the radio battery and my small reading lamp. It chugged along with its usual cacophony, for about 40 minutes, then, with a sputtering cough, fell silent. The sudden absence of its roar was deafening, amplifying the oppressive stillness of the forest. I checked the fuel ample. I checked the connections secure. There was no discernible reason for it to stop. The conditions of the rule were perfectly met. A clear, though overcast, not stormy day, no wind, and a complete cessation of function. The urge to tinker with it, to coax it back to life, was strong. It was a mechanical problem, surely, something a logical mind could diagnose and fix. But the rule, and the growing catalog of inexplicable events, stayed my hand. I left it, a silent, inert lump of metal, and the cabin felt darker, more vulnerable, without its potential for light and communication. The most profound violation of my personal space, however, came that night, or rather, in the small hours of the morning. Rule 8. If you wake to find all your books rearranged on the shelves, leave the cabin for 1 hour, regardless of the weather. Do not attempt to put them back in order until you return. My books, they were my companions, my link to the world of reason and intellect I felt slipping away. I had arranged them meticulously on the small, built-in shelf. Philosophy, history, a few volumes of classic literature. I awoke with a start, a sense of profound unease washing over me, even before my eyes focused. The kerosene lamp, which I now left burning low all night, cast a feeble, flickering glow. And there they were, my books. Every single one had been pulled from the shelf and stacked in a haphazard, teetering tower in the center of the small cabin floor. Not just rearranged, but desecrated, their order violated in a way that felt deeply personal, almost mocking. A cold fury mixed with a primal fear coursed through me. This was not a subtle creak or a distant sound. This was a direct, tangible act within my sanctuary. My first instinct was to rush forward, to restore order, to reclaim that small piece of my sanity. But the rule, stark and absolute, held me back. Leave the cabin for 1 hour, regardless of the weather. The wind had picked up, howling around the tower now, and a thin, icy rain had begun to fall, lashing against the windows. To go out onto that exposed catwalk, 60 feet above the ground, in this weather, in the dead of night, was madness. Yet, the alternative, to defy the rule, to remain in the cabin with whatever entity had demonstrated such intimate access to my space, felt even more dangerous. My hands trembled as I pulled on my boots and raincoat. The metal of the trapdoor handle was cold, shockingly so. Stepping out onto the catwalk was like stepping into another world, a realm of shrieking wind and stinging rain. The narrow walkway offered little protection. I clung to the railing, the steel vibrating with the force of the gale, and made my slow, terrifying circuit of the cabin. The forest below was a black, roaring abyss. Every shadow seemed to coalesce into a watching presence. Every gust of wind felt like an icy breath on my neck. The hour stretched into an eternity. I was exposed, vulnerable, a tiny, insignificant figure pitted against the vast, indifferent power of the storm, and whatever unseen things inhabited this peak. The fear was a living thing, coiling in my gut, constricting my chest. Was this the point? to drive me out, to test my obedience, to show me how utterly powerless I was. When the hour was finally, agonizingly up, I timed it on my watch. Its luminous dial a small beacon of order in the chaos. I practically fell back into the cabin, soaked, shivering, and utterly demoralized. The tower of books still stood in the center of the floor. I waited until the first hint of gray dawn touched the eastern sky before I dared to touch them. My hands still shaking as I restored them to their proper places on the shelf. But they no longer felt like my companions. They felt like objects that had been touched, tainted, by something alien and unknowable. My attempts to communicate, my growing unease to Henderson during our scheduled radio check-ins were met with a frustratingly laconic dismissal. Rule 10's do not speak of what you see or during the deep hours of the night to anyone over the radio, unless it is a confirmed fire. Some things listen was a constant, nagging deterrent. How could I even begin to explain the whistling, the light, the carvings, the knocking, the rearranged books, without sounding like I had succumbed to cabin fever? I tried to be subtle. Conditions up here are a bit unusual, Henderson, I'd said one morning, my voice carefully neutral. "Oh, how so, Wells?" he'd replied, his tone flat. "Just. The quiet seems to have a peculiar quality to it some nights." A pause, then Henderson's dry chuckle. "It's a quiet place, Wells. That's the point. See any smoke, you let me know. Otherwise, enjoy the peace." The enjoy the peace. The irony was a bitter pill. The peace was a lie. The silence was a canvas upon which my deepest fears, and perhaps something far more real, were painting a terrifying masterpiece. I began to study the old logbooks, left by previous lookouts with a new intensity. Most entries were mundane weather reports, sightings of deer or elk, notes on maintenance. But then, tucked into the back of a logbook from a prior, I found a series of entries from a lookout named Thomas Ashton. His handwriting, initially neat, grew increasingly agitated. He mentioned unsettling sounds, a feeling of being watched, and, most chillingly, the rules don't make sense until they start to apply to you. His last entry was a single, scrawled sentence. "It knows I'm here. It knows my name." After that, the logbook pages were blank for several weeks, until a new lookout began making entries, noting that the previous occupant had departed unexpectedly. A cold dread settled in my stomach. Ashton hadn't just left. He had fled, and whatever he had fled from was still here, with me. The list of rules was not a prank. It was a survival guide, a set of arcane protocols for coexisting with something ancient and malevolent that considered Blackwood Peak its domain. And I, Arthur Wells, the archivist, the man of logic, was now a character in a story far older and more terrifying than any I had ever catalogued. The question was no longer whether I could rationalize these events, but whether I could survive them. The deep hours of the night, once a time for quiet contemplation, were now a period of heightened vigilance, of listening for the whistle, for the knock, for the subtle signs that the rules were about to be enforced, and the thought that some things listen was a constant, paralyzing presence in the back of my mind. The discovery of Thomas Ashton's fragmented, terrified entries in the old logbook marked a turning point. My carefully constructed skepticism had been eroded, replaced by a gnawing dread. The rules were not a prank, they were a litany of warnings. A desperate attempt by those who had come before to codify the terrors of Blackwood Peak. Each rule now felt like a scar, a testament to some past horror. The official regulations and conduct sheet, once an object of mild amusement, now seemed to pulse with a malevolent energy, a constant reminder of the precariousness of my situation. The following nights were a blur of heightened anxiety and fractured sleep. Every creak of the tower, every sigh of the wind, every rustle in the surrounding forest sent jots of adrenaline through me. I found myself obsessively checking the bolts on the western shutter, my gaze constantly darting to the trapdoor, my ears straining for the first hint of the whistling or the dreaded knocking. The silence between these events was almost worse, filled with a suffocating anticipation. My books, once a source of comfort, now seemed to mock me with their ordered rationality in the face of such primal, inexplicable fear. Rule 10. Do not speak of what you see or hear during the deep hours of the night to anyone over the radio, unless it is a confirmed fire. Some things listened became the most insidious of all. It isolated me completely, trapping me in a solitary confinement of terror. When Henderson's voice crackled over the radio for the routine check-ins, I would report, "Al quiet," my voice a hollow echo of the truth. How could I articulate the feeling of being watched by unseen eyes? The chilling certainty that the rearranged books were a deliberate, intelligent act of intimidation, or the unnatural smoothness of the light moving through the trees. He would think I was losing my mind, another city dweller succumbing to the pressures of isolation, and perhaps I was. The line between the real and the imagined was becoming increasingly blurred. One particularly brutal night, the wind howled like a banshee, rattling the tower with such violence I feared it might be torn from its moorings. Rain lashed against the windows in horizontal sheets, and the entire structure groaned and swayed. Sleep was out of the question. I sat at the desk, the kerosene lamp casting wild, dancing shadows. My knuckles white as I gripped a heavy iron skillet, the closest thing I had to a weapon. Around 200 a.m. Amidst the storm's fury, I heard it, a sound that chilled me to the bone, despite the stove's warmth. It was a soft, rhythmic scratching, seemingly coming from inside the walls of the cabin. Not the frantic scrabbling of an animal, but a deliberate, methodical sound, like fingernails dragging slowly across wood. It moved, circumnavigating the small room, sometimes fading, sometimes growing louder, a horrifying accompaniment to the storm outside. I pressed myself against the far wall, skillet held aloft, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. There was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. I was 60 feet in the air, in a metal cage, surrounded by an elemental fury and something else. The scratching continued for what felt like hours, a relentless torment that frayed my already tattered nerves. I didn't dare investigate. I simply endured, a prisoner of my fear. The next morning, exhausted and hollow-eyed. I found new carvings on the inside of the cabin door, just below the laminated list of rules. They were smaller than the one on the tower leg, more intricate, a series of jagged, interlocking lines that seemed to form a grotesque, unblinking eye. My stomach churned. It had been inside with me, or at least something capable of marking the interior of my sanctuary while I cowered mere feet away. The logbook entry for that day was brief, my handwriting barely legible. Severe storm, unusual noises, new carvings on door interior. It was the radio incident, however, that truly pushed me to the brink. It happened on a still, moonless night. The kind where the silence of the forest felt absolute and watchful. I had actually managed to drift into a light, uneasy sleep when the radio crackled to life. My eyes snapped open. The luminous dial of my watch read 3:07 a.m. Rule 3. A children's song. But it wasn't a song. It was a voice. A child's voice, distorted and filled with a chilling, artificial sweetness. "Arthur." It whispered, the sound seeming to come from inches away, though the radio was across the room. "Arthur, let me in. It's cold out here." My blood turned to ice. It knew my name. Thomas Ashton's final, scrawled entry flashed in my mind. It knows my name. This wasn't random. This was personal. The voice was soft, pleading, yet utterly devoid of genuine emotion. It was the most terrifying sound I had ever heard. "I'm lost, Arthur." The voice continued. A faint, almost inaudible sobbing sound in the background. "Please, just open the door. I'm so alone." My hand shot out and slammed the power switch on the radio, plunging the cabin back into silence. But the voice lingered in my ears, a venomous echo. I sat bolt upright in my bunk, trembling uncontrollably. This was no longer about strange occurrences or unsettling noises. This was a direct, targeted assault. The rules were not just guidelines. They were the only flimsy barrier between me and whatever this entity was. I knew then that I couldn't stay. My carefully constructed solitude had become a torture chamber. The peace I had sought was a monstrous illusion. The inheritance from my mother, the desire for quiet contemplation, it all seemed like a distant, naive dream. The only thing that mattered now was survival. The next morning, at first light, I began to pack. My movements were hurried, frantic. I didn't care about fulfilling my contract. I didn't care about Henderson's reaction. I threw my few belongings into my rucksack, my eyes constantly darting to the windows, to the trapdoor, expecting at any moment some new horror to manifest. The list of rules on the door seemed to mock me with its calm, typed instructions. As I was about to descend the tower for the last time, my gaze fell upon the official logbook. With a shaking hand, I opened it to a fresh page. I paused, then wrote, "To whoever finds this, the rules are real. Follow them. Do not try to understand. Do not try to rationalize. Just obey. Your sanity, perhaps your life, depends on it. It knows." I didn't sign my name. The journey down the mountain was a paranoid flight. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat. Every rustling leaf sounded like approaching footsteps. I didn't stop until I reached the clearing where Henderson had left me, what felt like a lifetime ago. The hike to the gravel road, and then to the county road, was fueled by a desperate, primal urge to escape. I didn't look back. I never told anyone the full story of what happened at Blackwood Peak Lookout. Who would believe me? They would say it was stress, isolation, an overactive imagination. But I know what I experienced. I know the cold dread that settled in my soul, the certainty of a malevolent presence. Sometimes, late at night, when the wind howls outside my city apartment, I think I can hear a faint, high-pitched whistling. And sometimes, when I'm on the edge of sleep, I hear a child's voice whispering my name. The Blackwood Peak Lookout still stands, I assume, waiting for its next occupant. And the list of rules, I have no doubt, is still tacked to the door, a silent, chilling invitation to a world where logic holds no sway, and the deep hours of the night belong to things that listen. My name is Dr. Elias Thorne. I hold a doctorate in forest ecology from Colorado State University, with a postdoctoral focus on disturbance-driven ecosystems, particularly pyrophytic succession in the Southern Rockies ecoregion. This document is not a plea for help, nor is it a confession whispered from a padded cell. It is a report. It is the final, and only, truthful account of the events that transpired during my assignment in the Uncompahgre Pike Consolidated District from October to November of 2024. I have been deemed psychologically unfit for duty. My meticulously recorded findings dismissed as trauma-induced fantasy, the product of isolation and a mind unmoored. But the data does not lie. The measurements, the photographs, the coordinates, they are immutable. I am presenting my findings here, exactly as I recorded them in my field journal, before they are systematically buried under the weight of official denial and redacted into oblivion. My mission, on paper, was straightforward and, to me, deeply fulfilling: to conduct a multi-year ecological survey within a designated burn scar, a vast wound in the landscape left by the Hayman Fire years prior. The U.S. Forest Service required a comprehensive analysis of vegetation regrowth and faunal repopulation across several critical elevation zones. My study area was a remote, rugged section of the Pike National Forest, a place of dramatic verticality, where the land climbs from the rolling foothills at 7,000 feet to the stark, wind-scarred peaks approaching 12,000 feet. It is a world stratified by altitude, a living laboratory of ecological succession. The lower elevations are characterized by open ponderosa pine, savannas, their long taproots anchoring them in the dry, windswept soil, their barks smelling faintly of vanilla in the warm afternoon sun. They are resilient, fire-adapted giants. Higher up, these give way to dense, almost claustrophobic stands of lodgepole pine, a forest born of fire, their serotinous cones waiting patiently for the heat that will release their seeds and begin the cycle anew. Above 9,000 feet, you enter the subalpine zone, a dark, primeval world of Engelmann spruce and subalpine fir, where the air grows thin and cold, and the forest floor is a deep, damp carpet of fallen needles. Here, snowpack can persist in shaded hollows well into the summer, and the silence is so profound it feels like a physical presence. It is a landscape of profound beauty and unforgiving harshness, a mosaic of life zones, dictated by elevation, aspect, and the brutal whims of climate. My job was to quantify this recovery, to translate the forest's slow, silent, and tenacious rebirth into charts, figures, and peer-reviewed papers. I was a man of science, of empirical observation. I believed that everything, given enough study, could be measured, categorized, and ultimately explained. The first 2 weeks were a balm to my soul, a routine of demanding physical labor and mental peace. I established my base camp in a small, isolated Forest Service cabin, a sturdy but lonely structure of peeled logs and a green metal roof, and began the arduous task of laying out my transect lines. The work was a familiar meditation, driving steel posts into the rocky soil, stretching a surveyor's tape between them, and meticulously documenting every plant, every track, every sign of life within the prescribed area. The silence of the high country was absolute, broken only by the sighing of the wind in the pines and the distant, territorial call of a Steller's jay. The initial anomalies were subtle, easily dismissed as quirks of the wilderness. On the 3rd of October, I hiked to Transect 7, a line of marked steel posts, running through a recovering stand of quaking aspen. The 7th marker post, a 40-pound piece of steel I had pounded 2 feet into the ground myself, had been moved. It was not bent or knocked over, as if by a curious bear or a winter blowdown. It had been pulled cleanly from the earth and placed, with impossible care, 15 meters to the west. Around its base, a collection of milky quartz stones, gathered from a nearby creek bed, had been arranged in a neat, deliberate spiral. I cursed the thought of local vandals, logged it as such, and spent an irritated hour resetting the post, my scientific serenity momentarily disturbed. The first carcass appeared a week later, and with it, the first true tremor of cognitive dissonance. It was a mature bull elk, discovered in a high meadow of late blooming wild flowers near the edge of the subalpine zone. From a distance, it looked as if it were merely sleeping in the sun. As I drew closer, the wrongness of the scene became a physical pressure against my skin, a cold knot in my stomach. There were no signs of a struggle, no torn earth, no broken branches, no tracks, not from a mountain lion, not from a bear, not even the scuffed hoof prints of the elk itself. Most unnervingly, there was no blood. The ground beneath the animal, a carpet of Indian paintbrush and lupine, was pristine. The wound itself was a masterpiece of grotesque precision. The soft tissue from the jaw to the upper neck, including the tongue and larynx, had been excised, removed. The cut was a clean, almost cauterized line, exposing the white bone of the mandible. It looked less like the work of a predator and more like a surgical procedure, performed with an instrument of impossible sharpness and heat. It was reminiscent of the lurid tales I'd heard from the San Luis Valley, stories of mutilated cattle and a horse named Snippy, which I had always dismissed as rural folklore. Over the next 10 days, I found 2 more, a doe and a yearling, in different locations but in the exact same state of bloodless, surgical mutilation. The sights shared an eerie, uniform quality, an unnatural, sterile silence. No birds sang in the surrounding trees. No squirrels chattered from the branches. The ubiquitous forest scavengers, coyotes, vultures, even the carrion beetles and flies, were conspicuously absent. It was as if a sterile bubble had been placed over these locations, preserving them in a state of perfect, morbid stillness. My scientific mind reeled, desperately searching for a rational cause. A new, highly localized pathogen that caused rapid, bloodless decay. A typical predation by an unknown animal with an unheard of method of killing. Ritualistic activity by a local cult, perhaps one of the fringe groups, rumored to habit the woods around Manitou Springs, a place with its own strange legends of witches and animal remains. Every hypothesis crumbled against the sheer, defiant impossibility of the evidence. To process the growing cognitive dissonance, to try and force the phenomena back into the neat boxes of my worldview, I began a formal anomaly log in my field journal. It was a desperate attempt to impose order on the encroaching chaos, but the entries only chronicled my descent into the inexplicable. The first entry, on October 3rd, noted the moved transect marker, T7, now surrounded by a precise spiral of rocks. I'd labeled it as potential vandalism, but the anomalous factors were glaring. No tracks, human or animal, and the 40-pound post had been pulled cleanly from the earth. Then came the carcasses. On October 9th, I logged the first bull elk, hypothesizing an atypical poacher or an unknown predator, yet the evidence defied this. There was no blood spatter, no entry wound, no tracks of any kind, and a complete, unnatural absence of scavengers. By October 12th, I had found two more identically mutilated elk, a doe and a yearling. I speculated about a fast, acting pathogen or even ritualistic activity by a cult. But the sheer precision of the cuts and the continued lack of any human evidence rendered these ideas useless. The log did not help. It only served to starkly illustrate the failure of my framework. The impossibility escalated on October 15th, when all 10 markers on Transect 7 were rearranged overnight into a large, complex geometric pattern resembling a starburst. A coordinated team would have been required, working for hours in the dark. Yet they left no tire tracks on the access road. Not a single footprint. The final entry before I stopped writing was from October 17th. One of my subterranean soil probes, buried 30 centimeters deep, recorded an instantaneous temperature spike to 150 degrees Celsius at 20:14 a.m. The event lasted 3.2 seconds. It was a localized, inexplicable burst of intense energy, as there had been no storm, and no other probes were affected. This catalogue of impossibilities mocked my attempts at rational explanation. The world I knew, a world governed by predictable, physical laws and biological imperatives, was beginning to fray at the edges, unraveling like a poorly woven tapestry. I felt a new kind of cold settle deep into my bones, one that had nothing to do with the falling autumn temperatures and the shortening days. It was the cold, primal dread of realizing you are not merely observer of a system, but a tiny, insignificant component within a system that is actively, intelligently, and silently observing you back. The profound silence of the ponderosa pines was no longer peaceful. It was watchful, The phenomena escalated, shifting their focus. They moved from the tangible, static evidence of carcasses and moved markers to a direct and sustained assault on my senses. A psychological siege designed to dismantle my sanity piece by piece. The attacks began at night, alone in my cabin, miles from any other human soul. Surrounded by an ocean of black forest, I started to hear things. At first, it was a faint, discordant melody that seemed to drift on the wind, like the sound of a distant orchestra, tuning up in a vast, empty concert hall. I would stand at the cabin's single pane window, peering into the impenetrable blackness of the spruce forest, my breath fogging the cold glass, trying to locate a source. A radio. Late-night campers with peculiar taste in music. But the sound was too clean, too ethereal, and it seemed to come from all directions at once. A non-localized acoustic anomaly that defied the physics of sound propagation. It was the exact type of auditory hallucination reported by the Lee family in the infamous Black Forest haunting, a case I'd read about with detached, academic curiosity. Then came the metallic sounds. A heavy, rhythmic rattling, like someone dragging immense, rusted chains across the granite bedrock of the mountainside. It was a sound from another age, a sound of dungeons and medieval ghosts, utterly alien to this wilderness of pine and stone. I would lie in my bunk, rigid, my muscles clenched, listening to it echo canyons for minutes at a time, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. But the worst sound, the one that scraped at the deepest, most primal parts of my brain, was the scream. It would erupt from the darkness without warning, a sound that tore at the very fabric of the night. It was not the cry of any known animal in North America. It was a horrifying hybrid, a fusion of a woman's terrified, piercing shriek and the guttural, predatory roar of a large carnivore. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated terror and incandescent rage, and it echoed for what felt like an eternity before being abruptly swallowed by the oppressive silence that followed. During the day, the auditory assault was replaced by a crushing, psychic weight, a constant, prickling sensation of being watched. I'd be kneeling to check a soil moisture sensor or documenting the regrowth of fireweed, and the feeling would descend upon me like a shroud. A cold, absolute certainty that unseen eyes were following my every move from the dense, shadowy cover of the trees. I started finding things on the rough hewn porch of my cabin, small, strange offerings left during the night. A perfectly spherical river stone, polished to a glassy smoothness, beyond what any natural tumbling could achieve. A single, iridescent raven feather placed dead center on my doormat. A small, intricately carved piece of wood that looked vaguely like a stylized human figure, its proportions unsettlingly long and thin. They were not overtly threatening, but they were deeply, profoundly unsettling. Messages from an unknown and unknowable intelligence. After a week of this relentless psychological warfare, I was fraying, sleep-deprived and perpetually on edge. My scientific objectivity shattered. I drove my forest service truck down the winding, corrugated dirt road to the nearest town, a small, historic place called Alma, clinging precariously to the side of the mountains. I needed supplies, but more than that, I needed the reassuring presence of other people, the mundane noise of civilization, to convince myself I wasn't losing my mind. Seeking some context, anything to anchor my experiences in a shared reality, I visited the town's small, dusty mining museum and historical society. The archives were a cramped back room, smelling of decaying paper and time. A collection of settler diaries, mining company ledgers, and brittle local newspapers dating back to the 1880s. What I found there did not comfort me. It terrified me because it validated my experiences. I found stories of my forest, stories that mirrored my own with chilling, uncanny accuracy. An 1890s article from a defunct newspaper, the Park County Prospector, spoke of a creature the lumberjacks called the slide, rock, bolter, a ravenous monster of local folklore, said to inhabit the steepest slopes, blamed for the mysterious disappearance of tools, supplies, and occasionally livestock. Miners' journals from the turn of the century were filled with hushed, fearful accounts of tummy knockers, mischievous or malevolent spirits they blamed for strange knocking sounds deep within the earth. Sounds that sometimes warned of cave-ins, or sometimes seemed to lure men towards collapsed tunnels and their doom. Then I found the file. It was a thin, manila folder, tucked away in a box of miscellaneous county records, simply labeled Unexplained Disappearances, Pike District. Inside were brittle, yellowed reports typed on manual typewriters. A family of 4 vanished from their locked cabin in the winter of 1888, leaving a full, steaming dinner on the table. A prospector named Silas Kane, who went looking for a hidden gold mine in the Flatirons and was never seen again. His mule found wandering weeks later, its saddlebags empty. And then, the one that made my blood run cold a 4-year-old boy named Alfred Bale Hartz, who disappeared from a family picnic near Fall River in 1938. The search was one of the largest in the state's history. The detail that seized my attention was a witness report from 2 hikers who, days later, claimed to have seen a small boy high on an inaccessible, sheer rock ledge they called the Devil's Nest. The reports noted a disturbing pattern, one that researcher David Paulides would later codify and name Missing 411 OS. The victims often vanished near boulder fields or creeks, in areas of significant Native American importance, places the Ute tribes considered sacred or taboo. My cabin, my base of operations, was less than 2 miles from a large, glacial boulder field situated right next to Tarryall Creek. In a box of miscellaneous historical pamphlets, I found one published by a local Ute cultural group. It was poorly translated, but its message was stark and clear. It spoke of the mountains not as inert rock, but as sacred, living beings. It warned against disturbing certain valleys and canyons, which it called places of emergence, where the veil between the spirit world and the physical world was thin. It spoke of a tragedy at Grand Lake, where the spirits of drowned Ute women and children were said to wail beneath the winter ice, a place the Utes considered bad medicine and avoided for generations. My study area, I realized with a jolt of ice, water dread, was not just a recovering ecosystem. It was considered sacred, forbidden ground. I drove back to my cabin as dusk was falling, my mind a chaotic whirlwind of folklore, history, and encroaching fear. I pulled over at a scenic overlook to watch the last rays of sun paint the jagged peaks in hues of incandescent orange and deep purple. The landscape was achingly beautiful, but it no longer felt benign or neutral. It felt ancient, aware, and predatory. And that's when I saw it. On a high, distant ridge, silhouetted against the fading, bruised twilight, a figure stood. It was tall, impossibly so, and stick-thin, its limbs elongated and angular. It was not a man, not a bear, not a deer. It moved with a swift, disjointed, unnatural gait, like a broken marionette or a glitching frame in a film. It took too long, loping, strides that covered an impossible distance, and then it simply vanished over the crest of the ridge. The sighting lasted no more than 5 seconds, but it was absolute, burned onto my retinas. My scientific skepticism, my carefully constructed worldview, shattered into a million irreparable pieces. I was no longer dealing with vandals or strange weather patterns, or my own fracturing psyche. I was dealing with a thing, and it knew I was here. The sighting of the figure on the ridge changed everything. The detached curiosity of the scientist was burned away by a white, hot flash of primal fear. It was replaced by the knowing, visceral terror of prey that has finally seen its predator. But fear is a powerful catalyst. It can paralyze, or it can propel. For me, it clarified. The scattered, terrifying phenomena were no longer random. They were pieces of a puzzle, and I now held the central, connecting piece. My rational mind, though battered and bruised, latched onto the one tangible clue. From my frantic research in the Alma archives, Devil's Nest, the name of the inaccessible ledge where the lost boy, Alfred Balehartz, was supposedly seen in 1938. I spread my topographical maps across the cabin's small table, my hands shaking slightly. There it was, a deep, isolated, and unnamed canyon in the most remote sector of my study area. But scrawled in faint pencil on this old Forest Service map was the same name, Devil's Nest. It was the epicenter. I knew, with a chilling certainty that defied logic and reason, that all the phenomena, the surgically precise carcasses, the impossible sounds, the watchful silence, the stick-thin figure, emanated from that place. I had to go there. I packed a light but essential kit. Extra water, high energy rations, my GPS unit, a reliable magnetic compass, a headlamp, and my geology hammer, its weight a small comfort in my hand. I set out at dawn, the air crisp and cold, under a sky the color of steel. The hike into the canyon was a descent into another world, a journey backward in time. As I dropped in elevation, the familiar ponderosa and lodgepole pines of the montane zone gave way to an ancient, towering forest of Engelmann spruce and subalpine fir. Their branches, heavy with thick, green moss, intertwined overhead, blocking out the sun and creating a perpetual, gloomy twilight on the forest floor. The temperature plummeted, a sudden, unnatural cold that had nothing to do with the altitude or the shade. My breath plumed in front of my face in thick, white clouds. Then, my equipment, my tethers to the modern, rational world, began to fail. The screen on my GPS flickered erratically, displaying a scramble of nonsensical characters before going completely dead. I pulled out my compass. The needle, instead of pointing resolutely north, spun uselessly, rotating in slow, lazy circles as if searching for a pole that no longer existed. I was navigating by instinct alone, drawn deeper into the canyon by a force I couldn't explain. The trees themselves seemed warped and diseased, their trunks twisted into agonized, spiraling shapes, as if they had grown in a place where the laws of physics were bent. It was then that I began to see the lights. At first, they were faint, ephemeral pulses in my peripheral vision, easily dismissed as phosphenes from exhaustion. But as I went deeper, they became bold and distinct, shimmering, silent orbs of cobalt blue, emerald green, and bled, red light that danced and weaved between the ancient trees. They moved with a silent, intelligent purpose, weaving intricate, geometric patterns in the gloom, sometimes hovering motionless before darting away into the shadows. I remembered reading the account of the Lee family, who experienced a terrifying haunting in the Black Forest. They described flashing lights like the 4th of July in their living room, phenomena a Hopi shaman had attributed to something he called a rainbow vortex, a gateway, a place where the membrane between the world of the living and the world of the dead was thin and permeable. I was walking through that vortex now. The air itself felt thick and heavy, charged with static electricity that made the hairs on my arms stand on end. A low, subsonic hum vibrated up through the soles of my boots, a sound I felt in my bones and teeth more than I heard with my ears. After what felt like hours of navigating this disorienting, luminous landscape, I reached the canyon floor. The sight that greeted me stopped me dead in my tracks, my breath catching in my throat. In the center of the valley was a perfect circle of barren, scorched earth, roughly 50 meters in diameter. Not a single blade of grass, not a single weed, not even a patch of moss grew within its sharply defined boundary. The air inside the circle shimmered with a visible, heatless energy, and the low hum was now a palpable, physical force that made my vision vibrate at the edges. And in the absolute center of the circle stood the source. It was a monolith, a 10-foot, tall, perfectly smooth, metallic rectangle, its surface a polished, non-reflective black that seemed to drink the dim light around it, creating a void in space. It was utterly featureless, seamless, and cold to the touch. It was identical in description to the mysterious object that had recently appeared and disappeared on a hill near Fort Collins. An object that had baffled the media and authorities before it was quietly removed. But this was no modern art installation or college prank. This felt ancient, eternal. It was a machine. It was a terminal. It was a doorway. I knew, with a sudden, terrifying clarity that bypassed all my years of scientific training and logical deduction, what this place was. This was the Sipapu, the place of emergence from the old Ute and Navajo, legends I had read about. The place where they believed their ancestors were led underground by, and people, to escape a great cataclysm. The place where the star people were said to enter our reality aboard flying seed pods. It wasn't a myth. It was a physical location, a functioning terminal between worlds, and it was active. As the sun began to set, its last rays unable to penetrate the deep canyon, casting long, distorted shadows across the valley, the monolith began to thrum with greater intensity. The hum rose in pitch, becoming a low, resonant tone. And then they emerged. They did not come from the monolith itself, but materialized from the deepest shadows at the edge of the clearing, drawn to the structure's energy like nocturnal insects to a bug zapper. My mind, my poor, scientifically trained human mind, struggled to categorize the impossible parade of creatures that shambled, skittered, and strode into the open. There was a hulking, bipedal form covered in shaggy, dark hair, its massive shoulders slumped as it moved with a surprisingly fluid, silent grace. Its sheer size and ape-like shape were unmistakable. A Sasquatch, a creature of campfire stories and grainy photographs, real and solid and smelling of damp earth and musk. Behind it, two gaunt, pale figures moved with the same disjointed stop motion speed as the thing I had seen on the ridge. Their limbs were too long. Their joints seemed to bend at impossible backward angles. Skinwalkers, the shapeshifters of nightmare legend, their eyes black and devoid of any light or soul. From the gnarled roots of the ancient spruce trees, a group of small, twisted humanoids scurried forth, their eyes glowing with a faint, malevolent phosphorescence. They were bent, monstrous caricatures of the wee tricksters, the old Cornish miners called tomahawkers, their faces wizened and cruel. And there were others, things made of shadow and flickering light, things that defied geometry, things for which our language had no words. They were not a pack or a herd. They were a collection, a horrifying menagerie of Colorado's darkest legends and cryptids, all gathered in one impossible place. They ignored me completely, their attention fixed on the humming monolith, as if waiting for a signal, waiting for the door to fully open. In that moment of pure, undiluted terror, I understood. The legends weren't separate stories. They were all true, all facets of a single, horrifying, intersecting reality. This valley wasn't haunted. It was a habitat, and I was trespassing. I was crouched behind a large, moss-covered boulder at the edge of the clearing, my body frozen in a state of absolute terror, my mind screaming. The creatures continued their silent, patient vigil around the humming black monolith, a congregation of impossibilities under the deepening twilight. The air grew colder, the resonant tone from the black slab deepening in pitch, vibrating in my chest cavity. I don't know how long I watched them, paralyzed by a fear so profound it felt like a physical weight pressing me into the earth. An hour, a lifetime, then a single, fatal mistake. Shifting my weight to relieve a cramping muscle, my boot dislodged a small, loose stone. It skittered across the face of the boulder and landed on the barren, scorched earth of the clearing with a soft click. The sound was insignificant, a tiny punctuation mark in the vast wilderness. Yet in the charged, humming silence of that valley, it was as loud as a gunshot. Every head turned, every pair of glowing black, or multi-faced eyes, snapped towards my hiding place in perfect, horrifying unison. The collective weight of their attention was a physical blow, a wave of malevolence that struck me with the force of a hurricane. The hunt began. I scrambled backwards, crab, walking away from the boulder, then turned and ran, my lungs screaming for air that felt too thin to sustain life. The forest that had been merely unsettling on the way down was now actively, malevolently hostile. The faint path I had followed was gone, vanished as if it had never existed. Trees seemed to shift and wreathe in my peripheral vision, their low, hanging branches grabbing at my clothes like skeletal hands. The ground itself became treacherous, roots snaking out from the earth to trip me, rocks turning under my feet. I felt a profound sense of temporal distortion, a waking nightmare. I ran for what felt like hours, my legs burning, my lungs on fire. Yet the sliver of moon remained fixed in the sky, refusing to move. It was the legend of Boulder's enchanted mesa, made terrifyingly real. A place where time itself became a fluid, predatory trap. Behind me, I could hear them coming. The heavy, thudding footfalls of the Sasquatch crashing through the undergrowth. The dry, skittering sounds of the smaller, gnarled creatures. And worst of all, that horrifying, part human, part animal screech echoing through the twisted trees, a sound of pure, murderous rage. I was not going to outrun them. I was not going to outfight them. My only hope, my only chance at survival, was to outthink them. My panicked mind, in a moment of desperate clarity, latched onto my training, my knowledge of the land. I remembered the geology of the region's steep, unstable scree slopes, a consequence of the rapid tectonic uplift of the Rockies. The canyon I had descended was a natural bottleneck, its walls sheer and fractured. An idea, born of pure desperation, formed in my mind. I veered off my frantic, pathless flight, scrambling directly up a steep, loose rock face, pulling myself upward with bleeding hands. The creatures followed, their unnatural agility allowing them to scale the treacherous incline with terrifying ease. I could hear them closing the distance. I reached a point just below the canyon rim, a section of heavily fractured granite and loose shale I had noted on my way down as being dangerously unstable. I pulled my geology hammer from my belt. With the last of my adrenaline-fueled strength, I began striking at the key stress points in the rock face. The sound of steel on stone ringing out like a frantic alarm bell in the night. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a deep, grinding groan that seemed to come from the heart of the mountain itself, the rock face began to move. A cascade of small rocks turned into an avalanche of massive boulders, a roaring, grinding river of stone and earth that poured down into the narrow canyon entrance below. I heard a final, collective screech of fury and frustration from the darkness before it was abruptly cut off by the deafening thunder of the landslide. I had buried the valley. I had sealed the door. I stumbled through the wilderness for 2 more days, delirious from exhaustion, dehydration, and profound shock. A pair of hikers found me on a roadside, miles from my truck, my clothes torn, my face and hands bloody, rambling incoherently about monoliths and monsters in a place called Devil's Nest. My official debriefing with my superiors, at the Forest Service was a quiet, humiliating disaster. I presented my logbook, my frantic sketches of the creatures, my soil temperature data, my disjointed but earnest report. They listened with polite, pitying expressions, exchanging glances that spoke volumes. The official conclusion, typed up and placed in my permanent file, was trauma-induced psychosis, brought on by prolonged isolation and high-altitude stress. I was placed on indefinite medical leave. My career, my life's work, over in an instant. The day before I was scheduled to be driven off the mountain, 2 men visited my cabin. They were not from the Forest Service. They wore plain, dark, ill-fitting suits that looked utterly out of place in the rustic setting. They didn't ask about my mental state or offer condolences. They asked very specific, very calm, and very unnerving questions. "Daguerre." "Thorn," the first one said, his eyes cold and analytical, described the sound the monolith made. Was it a steady hum? Or did it pulse at a measurable frequency? The second one asked, his voice devoid of emotion, "The lights you saw in the canyon, did they react to your presence, or did they follow a predetermined path?" They listened intently to my answers, nodding slowly, making no notes. They suggested, in a placid, reasonable tone that was more terrifying than any scream, that what I had experienced might have been the result of or conventional atmospheric testing from one of the nearby military installations, or perhaps a mass hallucination induced by localized infrasound phenomena from geological instability. Their calm, knowing denial was more chilling than the screech of any creature. They were not there to debunk my story. They were there to contain it. They confiscated my journal, my samples, and every photograph I had taken, citing national security. I am writing this now, years later, from a small, rented house in a flat, featureless landscape, as far from the mountains and their watchful silence as I can get. I no longer look at a forest and see an ecosystem of trees and animals. I see a veil. My final conclusion, the one I could not put in my official report, the one that keeps me awake at night, is this: all of it is true. The Ute legends of the Sipapu and the Star People, in their flying seed pods, the settlers' tales of the Slide, Rock Bolter, and the Tommy Knockers, the modern accounts of Bigfoot sightings, of surgically mutilated cattle, of the strange, dancing lights o' the San Luis Valley, of the ghosts on Riverdale Road, and the witches of Manitou. They are not separate myths. They are different people from different centuries, with different languages and belief systems, all trying to describe the same fundamental, impossible, and terrifying truth. There are places in this world, deep in the ancient forests of Colorado, where our reality wears thin. These are not places that are haunted by the spirits of the dead. They are places that are inhabited by another kind of life, a complete and parallel ecosystem that operates by a different set of physical and biological laws, one that sometimes bleeds through into our own. I did not discover a monster. I stumbled into a habitat. I escaped, and I sealed one of its entrances. But I know the monolith is still there, humming in the eternal dark, beneath 1,000,000 tons of rock. And I know that the deep, profound silence of the ponderosa pines is not empty. It is waiting. My name is Liam, and it is important to state from the outset that I did not go to sea seeking adventure. There was no romance in my decision, no siren call of the exotic ports, or the boundless, blue freedom of the ocean. For me, the sea was an escape, a place vast and indifferent enough to swallow the noise of a life I had comprehensively wrecked ashore. I sought the anonymity of a grueling, repetitive job, a routine so physically demanding it would leave no room for memory or regret. The maritime industry, I discovered, asks for little more than a strong back, a clean bill of health, and a willingness to trade months of your life for a paycheck and the obliteration of distance. I had all three in abundance. After securing the necessary credentials, a process that involved more paperwork than I'd anticipated, and a 5-day basic safety training course that taught me more ways to die at sea than I cared to know, I signed on as an ordinary seaman, an OS, the lowest rung on the deck department's ladder. My duties would be simple, mindless, and dirty: chipping rust, painting, greasing gear, and standing watch. It was perfect. The vessel I was assigned to was a container ship, a veteran of the seas named the MV Airbus. The name, I would later learn, was not a coincidence. It was a warning. Boarding the Airbus for the first time was an exercise in humility. It wasn't just a ship. It was a floating metropolis of steel, a moving mountain range of cargo containers, stacked 7 high, each one a mystery box of global commerce. The air was thick with the smells of salt, diesel exhaust, and something else, a deeper, metallic scent of decay, as if the rust was a kind of living organism slowly consuming the vessel from within. A constant, low-frequency hum vibrated up through the soles of my boots, the ceaseless heartbeat of the engines deep in the ship's guts. It was a sound I would come to associate with a very specific kind of dread. The living conditions were as Spartan as I had hoped. My cabin was a small, steel-walled box with a bunk, a small desk, and a porthole that offered a view of more steel. Privacy was a luxury afforded by a closed door, but never by silence. The ship groaned and creaked around me, a constant symphony of stress and strain. The other crew members were a collection of ghosts in boiler suits. They were professionals, Filipino, Russian, Ukrainian, men with wary eyes and an insular quietness born of long contracts and immense fatigue. They moved with an economy of motion, their faces set in masks of grim endurance. There were no friendly welcomes, only curt nods and a shared understanding that we were all here to do a job that took us thousands of miles from anyone who mattered. We were a community of isolates, sharing a floating prison. On my first day, after stowing my meager belongings, I was summoned to the bridge. The journey there was a disorienting trek through a labyrinth of narrow corridors and steep ladders. The bridge itself was a stark contrast to the rest of the aging vessel. It was a bubble of modern technology, a darkened room illuminated by the soft, multicolored glow of radar screens, GPS plotters, and digital charts. It was the ship's brain, a place of quiet, focused tension. Standing at the center of it all was the captain. He was an older man, perhaps in his late 60s, with a face that looked like it had been carved from driftwood and left out in the sun. His authority was absolute, an invisible pressure in the room that demanded silence and obedience. He didn't offer a handshake or a greeting. He simply turned his pale, assessing eyes on me, and for a long moment, he said nothing. I felt like a specimen under a microscope. "You are the new OS," he stated. It wasn't a question. His voice was gravelly, a low rumble like stones grinding together. "Yes, Captain," I replied. He gestured to the chart table. Lying there was not a modern binder or a clipboard, but a large, heavy ledger. It was bound in dark, cracked leather, the kind of antique you'd expect to find in a dusty archive, not on the bridge of a working cargo ship. Its pages were yellowed with age, and the brass corners were tarnished green. "Your predecessor was careless," the captain said, his gaze never leaving mine. "He failed to appreciate the importance of procedure. This vessel operates on a strict set of protocols. They are not suggestions. They are the terms of our survival." He opened the ledger. The pages were filled with entries, in a dizzying array of handwriting, some inelegant, looping cursive, others in a frantic, spidery scrawl. It was a log, but it spanned decades, maybe longer. He turned to a specific page, marked with a faded red ribbon. The heading was written in stark, block letters. "Atians far nebu hence." "Read," he commanded. I leaned over the table, my initial thought being that this was some kind of elaborate hazing ritual, a tradition to spook the new guy. But the captain's face was devoid of any humor. It was a mask of grim finality. I looked down at the handwritten rules. The ink faded but perfectly legible. 1. Your watch schedule is non-negotiable. Be on deck 5 minutes early. Never be late. Tardiness is an invitation. 2. All maintenance, chipping rust, painting must be performed from bow to stern during daylight. Never work towards the bow. Never work after the sun has set. It notices movement in the dark. 3. If you hear a song that sounds like a woman humming from a ventilation shaft, find the nearest sealed room and do not leave for 10 minutes. Do not listen to the melody. 4. The ship's manifest is a lie. The containers in Bay 12 are not to be inspected, secured, or approached for any reason. The chief mate handles Bay 12. 5. If, during your watch, you see a man on deck in a soaked, dark peacoat, do not make eye contact. Do not speak to him. He is not part of this crew. He is looking for his ship. Do not help him find it. 6. Never enter the chart room alone between the hours of L100 or 200 and the O24C100. The old maps are being consulted. 7. If a crewmate offers you a piece of salt beef after evening quarters, refuse it politely. That crewmate is no longer who you think they are. Report it to the chief mate using the code. The larder is spoiled. 8. Do not look at your reflection in the black water of the open ocean at night. It might not be your reflection looking back. I finished reading and looked up, a nervous laugh threatening to escape my lips. The rules were absurd, a collection of sailors, superstitions, and cryptic warnings that belonged in a cheap horror novel, not a ship's official orders. Rule 23 sounded like a garbled version of the Siren myth. Rule Faint 5, a ghost story about the Flying Dutchman. The one about the salt beef was pure paranoia, designed to sow distrust among a crew already isolated from the world. "Is this a joke, Captain?" I asked, trying to keep my tone respectful. The captain's expression did not change. If anything, it hardened. "Do I look like a man who jokes, Mr. Nolan?" he asked, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "There are forces in this world, especially in the deep places of the ocean, that defy easy explanation. This ship, the Erebus, has an arrangement with them. These rules are not for my benefit. They are for yours. They are the difference between you finishing your contract and being listed in this ledger as lost at sea." He closed the heavy book with a soft, final thud that seemed to echo in the silent bridge. The sound seemed to seal my fate. "You will learn them. You will obey them," he continued, his eyes boring into me. "And you will never, ever speak of them to anyone outside of this vessel. The world ashore is not ready for these truths. Your duties begin with the morning watch. Do not be late." He turned away, dismissing me. I walked out of the bridge and back into the groaning steel corridors of the ship. The captain's words and the impossible list of rules churning in my mind. The low hum of the engines seemed deeper now, more menacing. The smell of decay felt stronger. I had come to the sea to escape the ghosts of my past, but as the Airbus slid silently through the dark water, I had the sinking feeling that I had just signed on to a vessel that was haunted by something far, far worse. The first week at sea was a blur of exhaustion and punishing physical labor. My life shrank to the rhythm of the watch schedule. 4 hours on, 8 hours off, a cycle dictated by the ship's bell that cared nothing for day or night. As an ordinary seaman, I was at the beck and call of the bosun, a burly, taciturn Filipino man, whose hands were like leather mallets. My duties were the dirtiest on the ship. I chipped away endless patches of rust that bloomed like a disease on the steel decks. The rhythmic tink, tink of my hammer a pathetic counterpoint to the engine's deep thrum. I painted over the exposed metal with thick, acrid-smelling primer. I greased winches, coiled ropes, and scrubbed decks until my back screamed, and my hands were raw. It was exactly the kind of mindless oblivion I had craved. During the day, under the vast, indifferent sky, I could almost forget the captain's ledger and its list of impossible rules. I tried to convince myself it was an elaborate, cruel joke, a psychological test for the new man. But the behavior of the crew was a constant, unsettling reminder. They were a quiet, almost monastic brotherhood of the weary. They performed their duties with a grim efficiency that left no room for error or deviation. I noticed it most during the daily maintenance. The bosun would start us at the very tip of the bow, and we would work our way aft towards the stern. No one ever questioned it. No one ever suggested a more efficient pattern. If a tool was dropped, you walked the long way around to retrieve it, always keeping the work behind you. You never, ever worked towards the bow. And as the sun began to dip towards the horizon, A palpable tension would ripple through the men on deck. Tools were collected with a quiet urgency. Work stopped a full hour before sunset, no matter the task's state of completion. The second rule from the ledger: never work after the sun has set. It notices movement in the dark, was observed with the absolute devotion of religious law. My first test came on the 5th day. We were painting a section of railing on the main deck. The afternoon was hot, the work was slow, and I was lost in the repetitive motion of the roller. I didn't notice the sun bleeding orange and purple across the waves until the bosun barked an order to pack up. In my haste, I knocked over a can of gray paint, sending a puddle spreading across the deck plates. "Idiot!" the bosun hissed, his eyes wide with something more than just anger. It was fear. "I'll clean it up," I said quickly, grabbing a handful of rags. "No time," he snapped, grabbing my arm. "We go now." "But it'll ruin the deck," I protested, pulling away. The sun was still a sliver above the water. We had a few minutes. He didn't argue. He simply pointed towards the stern with a trembling finger. I followed his gaze. The ship's shadow was stretching, long and black, across the water. But it was the shadow on the deck that held his attention. It was crawling, elongating unnaturally fast, consuming the light. And where the shadow fell, the air grew still and cold. The low hum of the engines seemed to dip, to become distorted, as if passing through water. I felt a pressure in my ears, a profound and unnerving silence that was somehow louder than the noise it replaced. I looked back at the spilled paint. In the dying light, for a split second, I thought I saw the puddle ripple, not from the ship's motion, but as if something had stirred beneath its surface. I didn't need another warning. I dropped the rags and practically ran after the rest of the crew, my heart hammering against my ribs. No one spoke as we secured the gear and retreated into the lighted superstructure of the ship. The heavy steel door slammed shut behind us, and the normal sounds of the Airbus rushed back in, chasing away the terrible silence. The bosun shot me a look of pure venom and said, "You are lucky. It was not fully dark." He never mentioned the incident again, but after that, I was the first to pack up my tools. The rules were real. That chilling realization poisoned the sense of escape I had sought. The ship was no longer a refuge. It was a cage, and we were trapped inside with things that followed a set of ancient, malevolent agreements. My sleep became shallow, punctuated by the groans and creaks of the ship, each sound a potential threat. It was during one of these fitful nights, lying in my bunk, that I encountered the third rule. If you hear a song that sounds like a woman humming from a ventilation shaft, find the nearest sealed room and do not leave for 10 minutes. Do not listen to the melody. It started faintly, a high, sweet sound that I first mistook for the whine of a distant pump. But it grew steadily, resolving itself into a clear, melodic humming. It was a simple, beautiful tune, a lullaby that seemed to tug at a half-forgotten childhood memory. It was deeply comforting, and my exhausted mind yearned to drift off to it. I felt my eyelids grow heavy, a pleasant warmth spreading through my limbs. The sound was coming from the small, circular vent above my desk. Without thinking, I sat up, wanting to hear it more clearly, wanting to place the familiar, lovely tune. Then, the captain's words echoed in my head. Do not listen to the melody. Ice flooded my veins. I scrambled out of my bunk, my heart seizing with panic. The melody seemed to grow louder, more insistent, wrapping around me like a physical presence. It was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard, and every instinct told me to stay, to listen, to let it soothe away the fear and the fatigue. It promised peace. It promised rest. I clamped my hands over my ears and stumbled out of my cabin into the dim, red-lit corridor. The humming was everywhere now, seeping from every vent, vibrating in the steel plates beneath my bare feet. Find the nearest sealed room. My cabin door wasn't sealed. The corridor was a tunnel of the sound. A small supply closet stood 20 feet away. I lunged for it, my breath catching in my throat. The handle was cold and stiff. I threw my shoulder against the door, wrenched the handle, and tumbled inside, pulling the heavy door shut behind me. I was plunged into absolute darkness and a silence broken only by my own ragged breathing. The closet smelled of rust and cleaning chemicals. I pressed my back against the door, my body trembling uncontrollably. Outside, the humming continued. It changed then, the beautiful melody twisting into something discordant and searching. I could feel it probing at the door, a pressure against the steel, seeking a crack, a way in. I squeezed my eyes shut, counting the seconds, my mind replaying the tune, fighting the urge to hum it myself. It felt like an eternity, but eventually, the pressure receded. The sound faded, leaving behind the familiar, groaning heartbeat of the Erebus. I stayed in that closet for a full hour before I dared to open the door. The next day, I saw Andrei, a veteran Russian AB, checking the lashings on a stack of containers. His face was a roadmap of exhaustion, but his eyes were sharp. I approached him, desperate for some kind of explanation, some human connection in this shared nightmare. Andrei, I began, my voice low. Last night, the humming. His head snapped up. The casual wariness in his eyes was replaced by a stark, cold fear. He glanced around the empty deck, then grabbed my arm in a grip of steel. He pulled me behind a container, out of sight of the bridge. You do not speak of it, he whispered, his Russian accent thick and harsh. You heard it. You locked the door. I nodded, my throat dry. Good, he grunted, releasing me. You are not as stupid as you look. You follow the rules. All of them. You do not ask questions. You do your work, you take your pay, and you pray you see land again. That is all. He turned and walked away, leaving me alone with the chilling finality of his words. There was no help to be had. There was only obedience. That night, I had the midnight to 4 a.m. watch. The sea was a vast, featureless expanse of black, indistinguishable from the starless, overcast sky. The air was cold and damp. I stood on the bridge wing, the wind whipping at my jacket, my senses on high alert. I thought of the man in the peacoat, of the salt beef, of the chart room I was forbidden to enter. Every shadow seemed to hold a lurking shape. Every gust of wind sounded like a whisper. To steady myself, I leaned on the railing, staring down at the dark water churning alongside the hull. And then, I remembered the last rule. Do not look at your reflection in the black water of the open ocean at night. It might not be your reflection looking back. A cold dread, worse than anything I had felt before, washed over me. I had been staring at the water for a full minute. Slowly, against every screaming instinct, I forced my eyes downward. The ship's lights cast a faint, distorted glow on the waves. I could see a vague shape there, a pale oval of a face, dark smudges for eyes and a mouth. My reflection, it was just me. A wave of relief so powerful, it made me dizzy, washed through me. It was just a superstition, after all. I smiled, a weak, trembling thing. And in the black water below, my reflection smiled back. But it wasn't my smile. It was wide and utterly, terrifyingly hungry. I scrambled backward from the railing, my boots slipping on the damp steel of the bridge wing. My breath came in ragged, panicked gasps. The image was seared onto the inside of my eyelids, the pale, watery oval of my face twisted into a grin of pure, predatory hunger. It was a violation, a deep and personal mockery of my very existence. For the rest of my watch, I was useless. I stood with my back pressed against the bulkhead of the superstructure, my gaze fixed firmly on the deck, tracing the patterns of rust and old paint. I refused to look at the ocean. I couldn't. The fear was too great that I would see it again, that this time it would wave back with my own hand. Was I going mad? The thought was a cold comfort. Madness would be an explanation, a rational diagnosis for an irrational experience. But deep in my gut, I knew I wasn't mad. The ship was real, the rules were real, and the things they were meant to protect us from were real, too. The Erebus was a vessel sailing, not just on the ocean, but on a sea of dark agreements and ancient, hungry things. The hungry smile I saw was not a hallucination. It was a promise. The days that followed were a slow descent into paranoia. Sleep offered no escape, only a shallow, dream-haunted reprieve. Every creak of the ship's hull was a footstep in the corridor. Every shadow in a corner was a waiting figure. I performed my duties on autopilot, my mind a frantic loop of the captain's rules. I chipped rust, I painted, I greased gears, always moving from bow to stern, always finishing before the sun bled out across the horizon. I became a model of obedience, because obedience was the only shield I had. The crew remained a collection of strangers, but now my isolation felt different. It was no longer just the professional distance of men doing a hard job. It was a tactical necessity. I watched them from the corner of my eye, studying their faces, their movements. Who among them had heard the humming? Who had seen the man in the peacoat? Who had refused the salt beef? The seventh rule had burrowed into my mind, transforming the mess hall from a place of brief respite into a minefield of potential threats. If a crewmate offers you a piece of salt beef, after evening quarters, refuse it politely. That crewmate is no longer who you think they are. Report it to the chief mate using the code. The larder is spoiled. It happened a week after I saw my reflection. We were in the mess, the air thick with the smell of boiled potatoes and stew. I was hunched over my tray, forcing down the bland food, when one of the Ukrainian ABs, a man named Sasha, sat opposite me. He was a big man with a perpetually tired face, but he'd always given me a curt, non-hostile nod when we passed. He was as close to a friend as I had on this floating purgatory. He slid a small, greasy piece of dark meat across the table toward me. "Extra ration," he said, his voice a low rumble. "You are skinny. Need meat on your bones." I froze, my spoon halfway to my mouth. It was salt beef. My blood ran cold. I looked at Sasha's face. His eyes were the same tired blue they had always been. There was a faint, almost friendly smile on his lips. Nothing seemed out of place, but the rule was absolute.
"No, thank you,"
I said, my voice barely a whisper. I cleared my throat, trying to sound casual. "My stomach, it is not good today." Sasha's smile didn't falter, but his eyes held mine for a fraction too long. An unnerving stillness settled over him. "As good?" he insisted, pushing the meat a little closer. "Good salt."
"Curacao."
"I can't," I said, more forcefully this time, pushing the small plate back towards him. "Thank you, but no." For a long moment, he just stared at me. The ambient noise of the mess hall, the clatter of cutlery, the low murmur of conversations in a half-dozen languages seemed to fade away. It was just me and Sasha, and the piece of meat between us. Then, the moment broke. He shrugged, a gesture that seemed almost too casual, and popped the piece of beef into his own mouth. He chewed slowly, his eyes never leaving mine. I felt a profound, animal terror. I mumbled an excuse and fled the mess hall, the feeling of his gaze burning into my back. I knew what I had to do. The chief mate was the ship's second in command, a wary, hawk-faced Filipino man who moved with a silent, coiled intensity. He was even more remote than the captain. A man who seemed to communicate only in orders and disapproving glares. Finding him alone was difficult, but I eventually cornered him as he was leaving the chart room. "Chief mate," I said, my heart hammering. He turned, his expression one of pure annoyance. "What?" I swallowed hard, the coded words feeling foolish and theatrical on my tongue. "Sir, the larder is spoiled." The change was instantaneous and terrifying. The annoyance in his eyes was extinguished, replaced by an expression of absolute, cold gravity. It was the look of a man hearing a confirmed casualty report. He didn't ask who, or when, or how I knew. He didn't have to. He simply gave a single, sharp nod. "Understood," he said, his voice low and devoid of any emotion. "Go to your cabin. You were never here. This conversation did not happen. You will not speak of this to anyone. Ever." He turned and walked away, leaving me trembling in the corridor. The next day, Sasha was gone. I didn't see him on deck, or in the mess hall, or in the passageways. It was as if he had never existed. I asked another seaman about him, a Russian I'd worked with. The man just gave me a blank look. "Sasha. There is no Sasha in this crew." The denial was so flat, so complete, that I almost believed him. I started to doubt my own memory, my own sanity. Had I invented him? But I knew I hadn't. The Airbus wasn't just haunted. It was actively editing itself, pruning its crew, erasing its history. My duties became my only anchor to reality. A few days later, the bosun assigned me to a chipping and painting detail on the aft deck, near Bay 12. The name sent a fresh spike of fear through me. Rule 14. The ship's manifest is a lie. The containers in Bay 12 are not to be inspected, secured, or approached for any reason. The chief mate handles Bay 12. The containers in Bay 12 were different from the others. They were older, a mottled collection of rust-streaked, unmarked boxes that looked like they had been at sea for 100 years. They bore no logos, no serial numbers. They were anonymous, silent monoliths. I tried to keep my distance, focusing on my work. The rhythmic tink, tink, tink of my hammer, the only sound besides the endless rush of the sea. But then I heard another sound. It was faint at first, a soft, rhythmic scratching coming from inside one of the containers. Scratch, pause, scratch, pause. It was a sound that did not belong, the sound of a trapped animal. My blood froze. I lowered my hammer, listening. The scratching was steady, patient, and it was coming from the container closest to me. I took an involuntary step closer, my mind screaming at me to run. As I hesitated, I saw the chief mate approaching. He was carrying a heavy, lumpy canvas sack over his shoulder. He didn't seem to see me. He moved with a grim purpose, heading directly for the container that was making the noise. He pulled a heavy, old-fashioned key from his pocket and fitted it into the container's locking mechanism. I ducked behind a winch, my heart threatening to burst from my chest. The chief mate grunted with effort as he swung the heavy steel door open. The scratching sound stopped instantly. For a single, horrifying second, I saw a glimpse of the interior before the door blocked my view. It wasn't filled with cargo. It was empty. The steel walls stained with something dark and covered in deep, frantic gouges, as if a beast had been clawing at the metal for an eternity. The chief mate hefted the canvas sack from his shoulder. It squirmed in his grip. He threw it into the darkness of the container. I heard a soft, wet thud, followed by a new sound. A low, guttural tearing, and a thick, slurping noise that made my stomach heave. The chief mate slammed the door shut, the heavy bolt clicking into place with a sound of absolute finality. He stood for a moment, his back to me, before turning and walking away, leaving me alone with the silence and the horrifying knowledge of what the Erebus was truly carrying. It wasn't cargo. It was food. The knowledge of what was in Bay 12 festered inside me like a sickness. The ship was no longer just a haunted vessel. It was a mobile abattoir, a charnel house, sailing a predetermined course of sacrifice. My work became a hollow pantomime. I chipped rust and painted steel, but my mind was filled with the sound of scratching from within a metal box, the wet thud of the canvas sack, and the slurping, tearing noises that followed. I was now an accomplice. My silence was complicity. The remaining week of our voyage was steeped in a suffocating tension. The other crew members, who had once been merely distant, now actively avoided me. Their eyes would slide away when I approached. Conversations would cease. I realized they knew I had seen the chief mate. I had witnessed the feeding. In the unspoken hierarchy of this ship, I had crossed a line. I was no longer just a new hand learning the ropes. I was a witness, a loose thread in the tightly woven fabric of their monstrous secret. The isolation I had once craved had become a form of solitary confinement, and I was terrified of what sentence would be passed. My fear was a physical thing, a cold weight in my stomach that never left. I ate little, slept less. The rules, which had once been my shield, now felt like the bars of my cage. I found myself reciting them in my head, a frantic mantra against the encroaching madness. Do not listen to the melody. Do not speak to the man in the peacoat. Do not look at your reflection. But there was no rule for what I had seen. There was no protocol for knowing that we were ferrying caged gods or devils across the ocean, and that their sustenance was the flesh of the disappeared. The night before we were due to make port, my terror finally curdled into a desperate, reckless need for answers. I couldn't bear the not knowing anymore. I couldn't face the idea of stepping back onto dry land with this horror locked behind my teeth, wondering if I would be allowed to leave, or if I would simply be raced, like Sasha. There was one rule I had yet to break, one sanctuary of secrets I had yet to violate. Never enter the chart room alone between the hours of 0200 and 0400. The old maps are being consulted. At 0230, when the ship was deep in the belly of the night watch, I slipped out of my cabin. The corridors were lit with the same dim red emergency lights, but they seemed to pulse with a malevolent energy. The hum of the engines felt like a predator's purr. I made my way to the bridge, my heart a frantic drum against my ribs. The chart room door was unlocked. I pushed it open and stepped inside, pulling it softly shut behind me. The room was unnaturally cold. The air was still and heavy, like in a crypt. And on the large, wooden chart table, illuminated by a single low, hanging lamp, lay the ledger. It was open. Beside it, spread out like ancient scrolls, were not modern nautical charts, but old hand-drawn maps made of vellum or animal hide. They depicted coastlines I didn't recognize, with continents shaped strangely, as if from a forgotten age of the world. And in the middle of a vast, empty expanse of ocean, a location was circled in faded, brownish red ink. There were no coordinates, only a name written in archaic script, Leviathan's Rest. My hands trembling, I leaned over the ledger. It was open to a page filled with names, dozens of them, each followed by a date and a short, chilling epitaph. Lost at sea storm. Lost at sea accident. Lost at sea carelessness. I found the entry for my predecessor, Thomas Miller. Lost at sea, failed to observe protocol. He hadn't been careless. He had broken the rules. He had learned the truth. I flipped through the brittle pages, a history of dread and death spanning centuries. The handwriting changed, the ink faded, but the story was the same. This ship, or one like it, had been sailing this route for a very, very long time. It was a prison, a duty, a curse passed down through generations of sailors who were trapped by what they knew. The old maps are not for living eyes, Mr. Nolan. The captain's voice came from the darkness behind me. I didn't jump. The sound was so quiet, so final, it felt it had always been there. I turned slowly. He stood in the doorway, his face a mask of ancient wariness. He wasn't angry. He was just sad. "What is this ship?" I whispered, my voice cracking. "It is a necessity," he said, stepping into the light. "There are things in this world, Mr. Nolan, that were here long before us. Things that sleep in the deep places. So long as they sleep, the world is safe. But they hunger, even in their slumber. The Erebus is not a cargo ship. It is a key. It is a promise. We sail the old routes, the forgotten lines of power, and we keep the peace. We deliver the offering, so that they do not wake and come ashore to collect it themselves." My mind reeled. The containers in Bay 12, the scratching, Sasha. It all clicked into place with a horrifying, soul-crushing logic. We weren't just feeding them. We were jailers, wardens of a planetary prison. "So, what happens now?" I asked, my gaze falling back to the ledger, to the long list of the lost. "Am I to be an accident? Another entry in your book? Your fate is not yet written," the captain said, his voice softening. "But you cannot go back. You know the truth. The world ashore cannot handle this truth. It is a fragile, brittle thing, their reality. It would shatter." He walked to the table and turned the final page of the great ledger. There, on the last page, written in the same stark block letters as the heading for the rules, was a single, final regulation. It was unnumbered, an addendum to the covenant. "THEC must es par. The chief mate has served his term," the captain said, his pale eyes meeting mine. "He has performed his duties. He has earned his rest. He will go ashore. And he will speak of this to no one, because he knows the consequences. But the larder must still be tended. The offering must be made. The ship must have a keeper, someone who understands the weight of the task, someone who has seen the blood drained from my face, the canvas sack, the key, the tearing sounds. It was a job, a position, a life sentence." The next morning, the Erebus docked. The familiar sounds of port, the shouting of dock workers, the screech of cranes, felt alien, like sounds from another world. I stood on the deck and watched as the crew disembarked. The men who had avoided my gaze for a week now walked past me, their faces blank, their bags slung over their shoulders. They were free. The chief mate was the last to leave. He was dressed in civilian clothes, looking like any other man. He didn't look at me as he walked down the gangplank and vanished into the crowd. A ghost returning to a life I could no longer have. The captain came and stood beside me. He held out a set of large, old-fashioned iron keys. In the other hand, he held a heavy, empty canvas sack. "The new hands will be boarding soon," he said quietly. "They will need their rules." I didn't move. I couldn't. I was paralyzed by the sheer, crushing weight of my new reality. I had come to sea to escape my ghosts, and in doing so, I had become one. I looked down at my hands, and then at my faint reflection in the polished brass of the bridge window. The face that looked back was pale and thin, but for a fleeting, horrifying moment, I saw its lips pull back into a smile. It was wide and sharp and utterly, terrifyingly hungry. I had found my place on the Airbus. I took the keys.